Hello, my dear friends. They covered their faces with other people's rancid bath water, rubbed oil from a genie lamp on their skin, and slept next to rotting animal carcasses to smell like royalty. These were the hygiene rituals that ancient Roman queens believed preserved their beauty. In palaces filled with marble and pure gold, there were habits that would make anyone today nauseous. Tonight, you'll slip into their chambers and uncover the rotting rituals of imperial beauty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to wander through the private chambers of Roman queens, one might be startled by the sight of a golden liquid kept carefully in jars and bowls, not for disposal, but for daily use. The belief that urine could cleanse the face, brighten the skin, and heal blemishes was taken as common wisdom among the highest ranks of society. To them, what might appear filthy or repulsive today was considered an elixir of beauty and strength. This practice was not an occasional oddity but a regular routine, passed along by whispers of court attendants and reinforced by traditions that no one dared to question. The urine itself was rarely from the queens alone. Servants collected it from slaves, from public baths, or even from common pots placed in the streets. Fresh urine was seen as less effective, so it was often stored for days until fermentation changed its character, releasing a sharp scent that spread through the chambers. The jars were kept in corners, half covered, but the odour could not be hidden. When applied to the face, it left a sting and a burning that was mistaken for cleansing. The skin reddened at first, then peeled in patches, giving the impression of renewal. In truth, infections often followed, but those were explained away as the body releasing impurities. Every morning, ritual and repetition made this habit part of the rhythm of life. A queen would sit in front of a bronze mirror while her attendants dipped cloths into the fermented liquid and rubbed her cheeks and forehead. Drops ran down her neck, soaking into robes made of fine fabric, and the servants quickly wiped them away with rags. The smell lingered, sour and penetrating, yet in the silence of the chamber it was endured as if it were a gift of the gods. The thought of beauty was stronger than the discomfort, and for women under constant scrutiny, every sacrifice seemed justified. It almost feels laughable that someone could believe fermented urine was a secret to beauty, but belief often outweighed common sense. Some noble women went further still. Beyond rubbing it on their skin, they swished it around in their mouths in the hope of whitening teeth and freshening breath. The taste was bitter and foul, and it left sores in the gums, but this was considered a mark of dedication. Accounts suggest that even in gatherings, faint traces of the smell could be detected when these women spoke. Yet, because the practice was tied to nobility, no one dared openly mock it. Attendants simply bowed their heads and continued their service, though many later wrote of the disgust they felt in private notes or secret diaries. The logic behind these actions was built on fragments of observation mixed with superstition. Urine contained ammonia, which does have cleansing properties. Without modern science, people noticed that it could whiten fabrics or remove stains. From this came the assumption that it could also purify the body. What began as a laundry practice turned into a beauty practice, and once the elite embraced it, the idea spread quickly. It is not so different from today's world, where expensive creams are sold with promises of miracles, and buyers often overlook the harsh chemicals hidden inside. The risks were serious. Skin exposed to fermented urine developed ulcers, and repeated use caused lasting scars. Infections spread easily, especially in a time when water was not clean and medical help was limited. Servants sometimes carried these infections from one mistress to another, wiping cloths on multiple faces during the day. For them, refusal was not an option. They obeyed, even as their own skin cracked and bled from constant contact. Roman queens were known for strict regimens, and their bodies became symbols of wealth and divinity. To keep up appearances, they tolerated the pain. The empire's obsession with appearance left little room for doubt or refusal. Young women entering the court were quickly taught the same methods, convinced that to abandon the routine would mean losing favour. In time, these practices became rituals of power, separating those within the palace walls from those outside them. I cannot help but feel disturbed when imagining such scenes, not because of the smell alone, but because of the unquestioning faith placed in it. The atmosphere of the chamber was heavy with contrasts: fine marble floors, golden lamps, and rich fabric surrounded bowls of rotting liquid. Attendants dressed in clean linen bent low while holding cloths soaked in sour urine. The contradiction was never acknowledged. Grandeur and filth existed together, and the illusion of refinement remained intact so long as no one spoke of the reality. Occasionally, rumours slipped into the streets. Some physicians whispered warnings, noting that rashes and sores worsened with use. But without authority to challenge queens, their voices carried little weight. To question the rituals of the powerful was dangerous. And so, the cycle continued, one generation after another repeating the same routines, convinced that beauty was worth any cost. Behind closed doors, these rituals shaped not only appearance but also reputation. A queen seen with pale, scarred skin was admired as devoted rather than pitied. Marks of damage were twisted into symbols of purity. In this way, pain and infection were transformed into virtues, and the women themselves became trapped in a system where suffering was celebrated. The memory of these practices has survived through scattered accounts, archaeological traces, and the shock of modern historians who uncover them. Each detail adds to a picture of a world where survival and vanity collided, and where the quest for beauty turned even waste into treasure. What was once considered sacred now feels grotesque, and yet it offers a window into the fragile line between knowledge and superstition. They believed that urine was a gift that could renew the skin, but in truth, it left behind scars and infection. From this obsession, stranger rituals were born, each pushing the limits of what the body could endure. The question that remains is just how far queens of Rome were willing to go when the pursuit of beauty demanded even greater sacrifices. The mixture of ash and animal fat was considered a solution for cleansing the hair of Roman queens, a routine that seemed ordinary in its time but feels unbearable to imagine today. Ash was collected from kitchen fires where wood and charcoal left their grey remains. Animal fat was gathered after butchering, often from sheep or pigs, and stored until it could be melted into a thick paste. When combined, the result was a rough, greasy substance that clung to fingers and left stains on cloth. Attendants prepared bowls of this mixture, heating it slightly so it would spread more easily across the scalp. The process began with a queen seated on a low chair, robes draped around her shoulders, while servants massaged the paste into her hair. The smell was strong and sour, a mix of burnt wood and spoiled meat, and it filled the chamber no matter how much perfume burned nearby. The ash scratched against the scalp, while the fat coated every strand with a heavy layer that shone dark in the lamplight. The sensation was sharp and painful, yet it was accepted as part of the cleansing ritual. It is almost comical that rubbing soot and grease into hair was seen as a sign of elegance. Yet tradition gave it authority. For those who endured it, the effects were harsh. The scalp often turned red within minutes, and small blisters formed where the ash pressed too deeply. When washed away with water, flakes of skin came off as well, leaving patches that stung for days. Some women lost clumps of hair, and others suffered infections that spread down the neck. Still, they returned to the same practice, convinced that enduring pain was proof of devotion to beauty. In a world where suffering was common, discomfort was rarely questioned. The logic behind this mixture was rooted in observation. Ash, containing alkaline compounds, could strip away grease, while fat provided a coating that kept the hair from becoming brittle. To Roman understanding, this meant cleansing and protection combined in one, but without the refinement of later knowledge, the results were crude. The ash burned as much as it cleaned, and the fat turned rancid quickly, leaving an odour that clung for days. Servants carried that smell on their hands and robes, spreading it through the halls even when the ritual was finished. Within the palace, appearances were everything. Shiny hair, even if achieved through such brutal methods, was taken as a sign of care and status. The wealthy had access to fat from well-fed animals and to ash from fine woods, while the poor had only dust and dirt. To the queens, the difference was a marker of superiority. What we see as filth was to them a luxury. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like a celebrity boasting about using industrial grease and oven ash as a premium hair mask. There were attendants who dreaded the task. Hours spent rubbing the harsh mixture into delicate skin left their own hands raw and irritated. They knew that infections were common, but to refuse service was impossible. Every servant was bound to obey, even when the queen screamed in pain as the mixture stung her scalp. Silence filled the chamber as the smell thickened, and when the ritual ended, both mistress and servant carried its mark. Accounts suggest that some noblewomen added herbs or oils to soften the mixture, but these were little more than attempts to disguise the odour. Rose oil, lavender, or myrrh might mask the worst of it for a short while. Yet the underlying stench always returned. Guests at banquets could sometimes detect the sour tang when a queen leaned too close, though etiquette forbade comment. The illusion of refinement held firm, even when the reality was clear to anyone nearby. I find it unsettling to think of grand halls filled with perfume and incense, yet all of it unable to cover the rot that clung to their hair. The consequences stretched beyond appearance. Open sores invited disease, and in crowded palaces where many shared the same attendants, infections spread quickly. What began as a beauty practice often ended in fevers that no one connected to the cause. Physicians offered little advice, bound by tradition and fear of contradicting the elite, and so the cycle continued, one head after another smeared with ash and fat, each woman hoping to emerge more radiant than before. Despite the risks, this ritual was deeply tied to identity. To abandon it would signal weakness, a refusal to uphold the customs of the empire. Queens were symbols of endurance, and their bodies became canvases of sacrifice. Pain and odour were dismissed as small costs for the image of control and grace. In truth, the suffering was constant, yet silence ensured it remained hidden. Archaeological evidence has revealed traces of ash and fat in grooming tools buried with noblewomen. These finds confirm what written accounts described, leaving no doubt about the reality of these practices. The mixture was not an isolated curiosity, but a widespread tradition, passed down and repeated without question. Hair, in Roman culture, was a marker of beauty and power. To keep it shining meant maintaining the illusion of divine favour. The irony is sharp methods that caused hair to fall out and skin to burn were believed to preserve charm and vitality. This contradiction tells much about the values of the time, where the appearance of control outweighed the truth of damage. The memory of these practices remains disturbing. To imagine the grandeur of marble halls mixed with the smell of scorched fat and the sight of blistered scalps is to glimpse the extremes of devotion to beauty. For those women, there was no choice but to endure, and their endurance became part of the myth of royalty. They trusted ash and fat to cleanse their hair, but it left pain, scars, and a stench that no perfume could hide. From this belief in transformation, harsher rituals would rise, demanding even greater sacrifices. The question that lingers is how much suffering was hidden beneath the crowns of Rome, concealed by the shine of false beauty. Animal blood was regarded by Roman queens as a secret tool for preserving youth, a belief that carried both ritual significance and the promise of renewal. Goats and doves were the most common sources, chosen not only for availability but also for their symbolic associations with fertility and purity. The blood was collected fresh during ceremonial slaughter, warm and thick, and stored in bronze or clay vessels. Attendants carried these containers carefully into chambers where queens awaited their daily or weekly treatments. What we recognize today as unhygienic and dangerous was, in that whirl, a prized method for maintaining beauty. The preparation was simple yet unsettling. Servants would dip cloths or sponges into the fresh blood and spread it across the queen's face, neck, and arms. The dark liquid coated the skin, drying into a sticky layer that cracked whenever she moved. For full-body rituals, queens reclined on couches draped with linens, while attendants painted the blood over every visible surface. The metallic scent filled the room, mingling with incense that burned in braziers nearby. Though the sweet smoke never fully masked the odour, it almost feels absurd that dried animal blood was viewed as the path to elegance, yet the weight of tradition made it appear unquestionable. The sensation on the skin was far from soothing. Blood coagulated quickly, forming a rough crust that tugged at pores and left behind irritation. When the layer was peeled or washed away, redness and swelling often remained. Many women developed rashes or small infections, but these were interpreted as signs of the blood drawing out impurities. In reality, bacteria thrived, and scarring was common. Still, queens endured, convinced that each session would restore vitality and delay the approach of age. The practice was tied to broader beliefs about life force. Blood was thought to carry energy, essence, and divine favour. By pressing it into the skin, the queen was thought to absorb these qualities, renewing not only her appearance but also her strength. Ritual prayers often accompanied the application, transforming what might appear gruesome into a performance of devotion. The queens were not alone in this. Lesser noble women imitated the practice when they could, though they often had access only to smaller animals and fewer attendants. Attendants themselves faced hazards. Prolonged exposure left their hands stained and their nails cracked. Some accounts suggest that servants occasionally fell ill after handling large amounts of blood, yet no complaint could be made openly. They pressed forward with their duties, wiping, spreading, and cleaning, even as the odour clung to their skin for days. Queens rarely noticed their suffering, focused only on the promise of rejuvenation. The rooms used for these rituals were decorated with luxury, yet the scenes unfolding inside were jarringly different. Marble floors shone with oil lamps while bowls of congealing blood sat nearby. Curtains of fine linen absorbed the coppery smell, leaving faint stains. Even when feasts or gatherings followed, traces of the ritual lingered. Guests may have caught hints of what occurred behind closed doors, but the illusion of refinement remained intact. If we look at this through a modern lens, it would be like someone proudly smearing butcher's leftovers on their skin and calling it a high-end cosmetic. The cost of these treatments was not only physical, but also social. A queen marked by blood-stained rituals was admired for her discipline, and scars were sometimes reframed as proof of sacrifice. Youthful appearance mattered more than health. Mothers encouraged daughters to begin early, ensuring that the cycle of practice continued across generations. For women who lived in the constant gaze of courtiers and rivals, there was no space to step away. Infections worsened with repetition. Accounts describe patches of skin that never healed, leaving dark blemishes across the cheeks and foreheads of noble women. Physicians lacked the knowledge to treat these conditions effectively. They sometimes applied more blood to cover the damage, turning the cure into a further cause of illness. This cycle of harm disguised as healing was not accidental, but a reflection of the values of the time. Appearances dictated reality, and pain was simply folded into the cost of luxury. Archaeological evidence has supported these accounts. Fragments of vessels containing traces of dried animal blood have been discovered in burial sites, alongside combs and mirrors. This suggests that the practice was not a passing fad, but a tradition deeply rooted in the culture of Roman elites. The discovery of chemical burns on preserved skin remains gives further weight to the accounts of damage left behind. I cannot help but feel a sense of unease when imagining the cold touch of congealed blood spread deliberately across the skin of women who believed it would make them beautiful. The image of queens reclining while attendants painted them with blood reveals much about the contradictions of their world. Luxury and horror existed side by side, hidden beneath the same roof. For the queens, it was not a choice but an expectation, woven into the fabric of the royal life. The desire for eternal youth demanded rituals that ignored suffering and embraced superstition. They pressed blood onto their faces in search of youth, but what remained were scars and infections that no mirror could hide. This ritual was just one among many, each stranger than the last, each demanding more from the women who carried crowns. The greater question is what other practices were quietly accepted, masked by wealth and power, while leaving behind evidence of torment for history to uncover. Fermented milk baths were regarded by Roman queens as an indulgence that signalled refinement and privilege, though the reality of the practice was anything but pleasant. Milk was stored in large clay jars for days until it curdled and bubbled with sour foam. By the time it was poured into bathing basins, the liquid had turned thick, with a pungent smell that filled the room before anyone stepped inside. Servants carried heavy vessels, straining under the weight, while the sour odour clung to their clothes and hands. The bath itself was a spectacle of status, yet beneath the marble and gold, it was little more than a pool of spoiled dairy. The queen would undress and lower herself slowly into the bath, robes folded neatly on a stool beside her. As she sank into the mixture, the foam clung to her skin, forming patches that dried into a sticky crust. The sensation was slippery at first, but soon turned uncomfortable as the sourness stung open pores. The smell, sharp and acrid, lingered long after the bath was over. Attendants fanned the air with perfumed cloths, but the effort was futile. It is almost amusing that soaking in spoiled milk was considered elegant, when today it would barely be tolerated in a barn. The logic behind the ritual stemmed from the belief that milk nourished both inside and out. Fermentation was seen not as decay but as transformation, releasing hidden powers that would strengthen the skin. Queens believed that bathing in this substance would soften the body, whiten the complexion, and protect against aging. The truth was harsher. The acids produced by fermentation irritated the skin, leaving red marks and occasional burns. Instead of restoring youth, the baths often left the body raw and inflamed. The rooms where these baths took place were decorated lavishly, with mosaics on the walls and lamps casting soft light, yet the sour odour was inescapable. The clash between luxury and filth was stark, but in the context of Roman life, appearances outweighed discomfort. Guests who heard of such rituals admired them as signs of excess and divine favour. To bathe in ordinary water was common. To soak in milk turned sour was the privilege of queens. Attendants suffered as well. They were required to stir the mixture with wooden paddles to keep the foam consistent and to wipe the queen's skin when she emerged. Their hands cracked from repeated contact, and many carried the odour with them for days. Yet silence was their only choice. To refuse would be unthinkable, and so they laboured, holding their breath as much as possible, waiting for the ritual to end. The effects reached beyond the moment. Queens often carried the sour smell into banquets or gatherings, masked only partly by perfumes. Courtiers who sat near them must have noticed, yet etiquette forbade comment. The illusion of refinement held, even when the truth was obvious. If we compare this to modern practices, it would be like filling a spa tub with expired yogurt and charging a fortune for the experience. Archaeological evidence supports the descriptions of these baths. Traces of sour milk proteins have been found in residue lining ancient basins, and writers of the time recorded the belief in its supposed powers. These accounts confirm that the practice was not isolated or rare, but a tradition repeated across generations. The persistence of the ritual shows how deeply superstition shaped the daily lives of even the most powerful. For the queens, the baths were not optional. To abstain would signal weakness or neglect, a failure to embody the ideal of eternal youth. Pain, smell, and embarrassment were dismissed as small costs for the appearance of divine beauty. Younger women were introduced to the baths early, ensuring that the cycle continued without question. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine the most powerful women of Rome reclining in tubs of spoiled milk, convinced that they were bathing in luxury rather than decay. The contradictions are striking. Palaces that gleamed with marble and gold were filled with the odour of rot. Rituals meant to elevate beauty left skin damaged and spirits drained. Yet within the empire, such practices were celebrated, written about, and passed down as if they were marks of civilization. The reality was far different, hidden beneath layers of wealth and pretense. The baths ended, but the stench clung to their skin, following them into the marble halls. Perfumes and incense could not disguise what lay beneath. Another ritual would leave behind marks even harder to conceal. Fish excrement mixed with aromatic substances and ash was regarded in the Roman world as a curious solution for bodily fragrance. Though the reality of its use was far from appealing, queens, in their pursuit of allure and refinement, turned to this mixture as a supposed charm to enhance their attractiveness. Servants prepared it carefully, gathering the excrement from fish markets or preserved stores, drying it when necessary, then blending it with ashes from burnt wood and oils meant to disguise the stench. To those within the palace, it was presented as a crafted cosmetic, though its base was waste and rot. The preparation began early in the day. Servants collected jars of the mixture, thick and grainy, with a colour that varied from dark brown to grey depending on the type of fish. Into this base, they added perfumes pressed from herbs and flowers, sometimes rose or myrrh, to soften the smell, yet the underlying odour of decay never disappeared. When the queen called for her daily ritual, attendants approached with cloths and bowls, spreading the mixture under the arms and across the groin. The ash left a powdery texture while the oils created a greasy film, coating the skin in a layer that clung long after the ritual was finished. It is hard not to smirk at the thought that fish waste was considered seductive, yet in their world, the bizarre often passed as elegance. The effect on the body was immediate. The ash and excrement irritated pores, and within hours, redness appeared, followed by rashes that grew worse with repeated use. Flies and gnats gathered wherever the queen walked, drawn by the sour-sweet odour of decay hidden beneath layers of perfume. Attendants carried fans not only to cool her, but also to chase away insects. The discomfort was constant. Yet in public gatherings, this strange fragrance was treated as a mark of refinement. The paradox was striking. Those closest to the queen might wrinkle their noses in silence, while courtiers at a distance spoke admiringly of her presence. The reasoning behind this practice was rooted in symbolic ideas about scent. Fish, connected to water and fertility, were believed to carry a vital essence. Their remains, when processed with perfumes, were thought to transfer this vitality to the body. Queens who wore the mixture signalled their devotion to fertility, abundance, and divine favour. This belief was reinforced through rituals in temples where similar substances were burned as offerings. The line between sacred and cosmetic blurred, and what we now see as filth became a visible display of status. For the servants, preparing and applying the mixture was a dreaded task. Their hands absorbed the odour, and no amount of washing could remove it entirely. Some recorded in later accounts that they avoided touching food for fear it would taste of the excrement. Yet refusal was impossible. They bent close, spreading the paste carefully, wiping away excess, and enduring the smell as part of their daily service. If we imagine this in modern terms, it would be like a luxury perfume house bottling the stench of a fish market and marketing it as a premium fragrance. In the closed environment of palaces, the scent became unavoidable. Fabrics, cushions, and even the marble walls absorbed traces of the mixture. Visitors from abroad noted the distinct odour in their records, though they disguised criticism with polite phrasing. For the Roman elite, however, it was normalised. The strangeness of the ritual was overlooked because it was tied to queenship, and to question it was to question authority itself. Health consequences followed inevitably. Rashes became chronic, open sores formed, and infections spread across the skin. Physicians offered ointments but rarely challenged the source of the problem. Instead, they often prescribed more perfumes to mask the smell of infection, compounding the cycle. Queens endured quietly, convinced that suffering was inseparable from beauty and power. The contradiction defined their lives to appear radiant. They carried both pain and decay. Accounts from the time suggest that some noble women believed the mixture made them irresistible. They spoke of how the odour marked them as different, set apart from the common crowds who could afford only basic oils. The presence of insects, oddly enough, was reframed as a sign of abundance, proof that even the smallest creatures were drawn to their vitality. What we see as humiliation was reframed into pride, showing how deeply superstition shaped perception. I cannot help but feel disturbed imagining women of power sitting in marble halls, wrapped in fine robes, while their skin itched beneath a coat of rot disguised as perfume. Archaeological findings add weight to these accounts. Residues of fish oils and ash have been detected in small jars unearthed in Roman ruins, alongside cosmetic tools. Inscriptions and records mention mixtures used for the body, described in terms that align with these descriptions. Together, they confirm that this practice was not a legend but a lived reality. The environment in which these rituals occurred was filled with contradictions. Golden lamps and decorated mosaics glimmered in the bathhouses, where queens emerged freshly coated with the mixture. Courtiers bowed, attendants fanned, and incense burned. Yet none of these could erase the underlying truth. Behind the glamour of empire lay rituals that transformed waste into symbols of nobility, tolerated because tradition demanded it. Over time, the damage became undeniable. Queens bore scars that no perfume could hide, yet their reputations insisted on youth and allure. Scars were painted over with powders, redness dismissed as vitality, and odours explained away as exotic. This reshaping of reality shows how power can distort even the senses, convincing people to accept what is plainly harmful. They smeared their skin with the refuse of fish and ash, believing it would make them alluring, yet it left them marked by sores and swarmed by insects. The fragrance of power was nothing more than the stench of decay dressed in ritual. What followed in other chambers would expose an even harsher truth, as rituals turned from discomfort into outright danger cloaked as purification. The ritual of drying the body with smoke from animal dung was one of the most unsettling practices recorded among the routines of Roman queens. Yet it was accepted in its time as a form of purification. Dried cattle dung was gathered, shaped into small clumps, and stored for these ceremonies. When lit, it produced a thick, acrid smoke that spread quickly in enclosed spaces. Attendants carried the burning material into chambers where women were instructed to sit above the smoke, letting it rise around and into their bodies. The belief was that this process cleansed impurities from within and restored a sense of untouched purity. To them, what we see as harmful was considered not only necessary but sacred. The ritual was conducted with an air of solemnity. Queens were seated on specially designed stools with holes carved in the centre, placed over small braziers filled with burning dung. The smoke curled upward, dense and pungent, clinging to the skin and entering the body through the most sensitive areas. Servants fanned the smoke to keep it concentrated, while others stood by with cloths to dab at sweat. The atmosphere inside the chamber was heavy, filled with the odour of burning waste, yet no one dared speak of discomfort. It is almost absurd to think that choking on smoke from dung was once associated with cleanliness. Yet tradition turned filth into ritual. The sensation was painful. Skin around the lower body grew hot, reddened, and sometimes blistered from the intensity of the heat. Queens shifted in their seats, grimacing silently as attendants looked on. The sting did not fade quickly. Even after the ritual ended, women walked with soreness that lasted for days. Some experienced burns that became infected, leaving scars that no perfume or powder could disguise. Yet the belief that this pain represented renewal silenced all protest. To endure was to prove devotion not only to beauty, but also to the moral codes that equated suffering with virtue. The logic behind this ritual drew from ideas about purification by fire and smoke. Dung, as the waste of animals, was paradoxically seen as both unclean and powerful. Burning it was thought to transform its nature, releasing a smoke that could banish corruption and restore vitality. Queens were told that their bodies would emerge tighter, fresher, and untainted, a promise tied deeply to cultural expectations of chastity. What was in reality an act of harm was framed as an act of preservation. Servants who prepared these ceremonies suffered as well. They inhaled the same acrid smoke while crouching near the braziers, their eyes watering and throats raw. Their skin absorbed the odour, which clung to them long after the ritual was over. Yet silence was mandatory. Refusal or complaint could mean punishment, so they continued, cleaning ashes, carrying dung, and ensuring that the queen's body remained exposed to the smoke. If we compare this to modern beauty routines, it would be like advertising a spa treatment where customers are asked to sit over burning trash and told it will make them younger. The environment in which these rituals occurred emphasized the contrast between luxury and decay. Marble floors reflected lamplight. Golden statues stood nearby, and perfumed oils burned in tall holders. Yet in the centre of this grandeur, smoke from burning dung filled the air, staining fabric and suffocating lungs. The contradiction was plain, but within the empire, such contradictions were accepted as part of life. Queens emerged from the chamber carrying the odour with them, cloaked in robes that only partly hid the marks left behind. The physical consequences were severe. Beyond burns and infections, women sometimes suffered from respiratory issues caused by repeated exposure to smoke. Inhaling the fumes led to coughing fits and long-term damage to lungs, though at the time these symptoms were attributed to weakness rather than the ritual itself. Physicians offered little help, recommending further rituals or ointments that did little to ease the pain. The cycle of injury continued, reinforced by the belief that harm was a form of healing. Cultural expectations played a large role. Queens were expected to embody purity, both for themselves and as symbols of the empire. Rituals like this one reinforced the idea that a woman's body must be constantly controlled, cleansed, and renewed, even at the cost of her health. Refusal was not an option. Younger women brought into the palace were quickly introduced to the practice, ensuring that the tradition remained unbroken. I cannot help but feel a chill when imagining these women forced to sit silently over smoke, their pain ignored in the name of virtue. Archaeological evidence and written accounts support the existence of these practices. Fragments of stools with carved openings have been found, alongside braziers containing residues consistent with burned dung. Writers of the time described the process in coded language, presenting it as purification without acknowledging its brutality. These traces reveal not only the practice itself, but also the lengths to which society went to disguise suffering as refinement. The lasting image is one of contrasts. Women wrapped in fine fabrics were made to expose themselves to smoke rising from burning waste. Servants fanned the air, not to bring comfort, but to ensure that the fumes penetrated deeply. The queens emerged marked by scars and carrying odours that clashed with the perfumes of the palace. Yet in the eyes of those around them, this was beauty, this was virtue, this was power. They endured smoke that burned their skin and filled their lungs, convinced it restored purity, while in reality it left them scarred and weakened. From this practice emerged an even darker truth that pain itself had become a measure of worth in the lives of Roman queens. Rituals did not stop at discomfort but pushed ever further, demanding new sacrifices under the guise of tradition. Undergarments made of coarse wool were part of the daily life of Roman queens, and these garments were rarely changed, sometimes worn for weeks until the smell and stains became too obvious to ignore. The fabric itself was thick and rough, woven to last through long use, but it clung tightly to the body, trapping sweat and dirt. Queens wore them under layers of robes and gowns, which made the garments even more difficult to remove. Washing was not considered practical, since wool soaked up water and took days to dry, so the solution was simple: leave them on until they could no longer be endured. The practice created a cycle of discomfort. After only a few days, the garments grew damp with sweat and body oils, becoming stiff in places and sticky in others. Rubbing against the skin, the wool caused irritation, leaving red patches on thighs and hips. Over time, sores formed where the fabric pressed hardest. Yet queens accepted this as normal, their attendants too fearful to suggest otherwise. It is almost laughable to think that such garments were seen as proper and refined when, in truth, they were more like traps of filth. Smell became part of the environment. In the close chambers of palaces, the odour of unwashed garments mixed with perfumes, incense, and the sour scent of sweat. Courtiers who attended feasts must have noticed, though etiquette forbade comment. To question the cleanliness of a queen would be dangerous, and so silence preserved the illusion of grace. Only the servants who helped the queens dress and undress knew the full truth, since they handled the stiff, stained fabric every day. Perfumes and herbs were used to disguise the problem. Oils of rose, myrrh, or lavender were sprinkled onto the wool, creating a surface fragrance that faded quickly. Some attendants burned incense near the garments before helping the queen dress, hoping the smoke would mask the odour. But the scent of rot and sweat clung stubbornly, rising again after only a short while. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like wearing the same heavy underclothes for weeks and spraying deodorant over them instead of washing. The consequences for health were clear. Infections of the skin spread easily, and rashes become chronic. Moisture trapped in the wool created a breeding ground for fungus, which caused itching and sores that sometimes spread over large areas of the body. Physicians had little to offer, prescribing ointments that were quickly absorbed into the soiled fabric, worsening the irritation. Despite the suffering, queens were expected to endure in silence. As cleanliness was considered less important than maintaining tradition, servants bore their own burden. They washed their hands raw after handling the garments, yet the odour lingered. They were required to fold and store them carefully, often in wooden chests lined with herbs. Though this did little to reduce the smell, servants sometimes whispered among themselves about the shame of the garments, but their voices never reached the queens. Obedience mattered more than truth, and so the cycle repeated with each generation. Archaeological evidence suggests that wool undergarments were preserved in burial sites, stiff with age but still intact. These finds confirm what written accounts described garments made to last, not to be changed frequently. The durability that was prized in Roman society became, for queens, a prison of odour and discomfort. Historians have noted that the presence of herbs among the remains suggests attempts to mask the smell even in death. The symbolism of undergarments extended beyond hygiene. They were seen as a sign of modesty and discipline, covering the body beneath layers of silk and linen. To abandon them would risk scandal, and so queens complied even when the garments caused pain. Wearing them for weeks without change became a silent expectation, enforced not by law but by tradition. The garments became part of identity, shaping how queens were perceived in both private and public life. Over time, the health effects became visible. Queens walked with sores on their thighs, their skin scarred from constant friction. Some developed fevers from infections that spread through open wounds, yet these signs were hidden beneath layers of clothing, never mentioned in public. In this way, the garments shaped not only their comfort, but also their silence, binding them to an unspoken suffering that was considered natural. I find it deeply unsettling to picture women of immense power forced into garments that harmed them daily, unable to speak of it because tradition left no space for complaint. The contradiction was clear. Queens lived surrounded by marble, gold, and fine silks, yet against their skin lay fabric filled with sweat, odour, and disease. This image reflects the larger truth of Roman life, where grandeur and decay coexisted without conflict. To outsiders, the queens seemed radiant, but behind the facade lay discomfort and pain hidden in every garment. They wore coarse wool against their bodies for weeks, enduring the smell, the sores, and the constant irritation, all in the name of discipline and tradition. Perfumes could not disguise the truth, nor could silence erase the marks left on their skin. From this practice grew even harsher rituals, where the demands of beauty and virtue outweighed comfort entirely, pushing women into suffering that left permanent scars. Bronze blades, roughly sharpened and never sterilized, were used by Roman queens in the pursuit of smooth skin, a practice that left behind far more suffering than beauty. The blades themselves were simple tools, crafted for durability rather than precision. Attendants rubbed them against stones to create a thin edge before presenting them to their mistress. There was no ritual of cleansing, no water boiled to prepare them, only the same instruments used on countless bodies over time. In chambers filled with the illusion of refinement, women submitted to the scraping of cold bronze across their skin, believing that smoothness meant youth, purity, and desirability. The ritual began with a queen seated on a stool or reclining on a couch, her body laid bare for attendants to work. The scraping started at her arms, moved across her legs, and always focused intently on the most intimate areas. Attendants leaned close, pressing the blades firmly into skin that offered resistance. Small nicks appeared almost immediately, red lines dotting the surface before turning into tiny cuts. Blood beaded along the wounds, wiped away with linen that was rarely washed before being used again. It is almost laughable that dragging crude bronze across delicate skin was considered refinement, yet authority made it unquestionable. The absence of antiseptics meant infections took hold quickly. Within days, the area scraped raw grew swollen and tender. Pus oozed from the cuts, sticking to garments and staining fabric. The pain made even walking difficult, yet the ritual was repeated regularly, believed to preserve an image of perfection. Queens bore these wounds in silence, while attendants continued their work without pause. Their duty was to perform, not to question, and so the cycle of blood and infection became routine. The smell of iron mixed with sweat filled the chambers during these rituals. Perfumed oils were sometimes applied afterward, not to heal but to mask the odour and give the appearance of care. The oil stung when poured over open cuts, sending sharp pain through the body, but it was accepted as part of the process. Attendants rubbed the oil into the wounds, spreading infection further, unaware that they were making the damage worse. The queens endured, bound by the belief that pain was a necessary price for beauty. The reasoning behind this practice was rooted in cultural ideas of purity. Smooth skin was associated with divinity and control, while body hair was seen as a marker of wildness. By removing it, queens aligned themselves with the gods, presenting bodies sculpted to match the statues that decorated their palaces. The irony is sharp. The statues themselves were carved from marble, while the women imitated them by cutting their own flesh. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like choosing to shave daily with rusted kitchen knives and then calling the scars a sign of luxury. Servants dreaded these ceremonies. They knew the blades caused pain and infection, yet their hands guided them steadily across the queen's skin. Some wrote later of the guilt they felt, forced to wound their mistress in the name of tradition. Others spoke of their own suffering, since they used the same tools on themselves when ordered to follow royal custom. The infection spread easily from one body to another, carried on the edges of blades never cleaned between uses. The contradictions were striking. Palaces filled with silks and marble echoed with the sounds of scraping metal against flesh. Queens who represented power and control submitted to tools that stripped them of comfort and dignity. The blood left behind was wiped away quickly, as if ignoring it erased its reality. Guests at court saw only the smooth skin that emerged later, never the scars hidden beneath robes. The illusion of perfection held strong, though it was built on wounds that festered beneath. Health consequences were devastating. Chronic infections led to abscesses that refused to heal, leaving permanent scars across thighs, arms, and the most intimate regions. Some queens were unable to walk properly for days after each session, yet ceremonies and duties continued without pause. Physicians offered little help, applying poultices that soothed temporarily but did not stop the spread of disease. In some cases, women carried infections for years, their bodies weakened by the constant strain. Archaeological discoveries give further evidence of this practice. Bronze razors have been unearthed in tombs, their edges dulled by long use, often buried alongside combs and mirrors. These tools confirm that shaving was not an isolated custom, but a widespread ritual across the empire. The scars found on preserved remains, particularly in intimate areas, align with the accounts of infections and sores described in historical texts. I cannot help but feel a sense of unease when imagining attendants scraping away at raw skin, knowing that each stroke caused more harm than healing. The legacy of these rituals shows how deeply beauty was tied to suffering. To the queens of Rome, smoothness was worth infection, scars, and constant pain. Each session reinforced the idea that the body was not their own, but an object to be shaped by tradition and expectation. Silence surrounded the practice, preventing any challenge to its cruelty. They shaved themselves with unsterilized blades, cutting flesh until blood and pus became part of daily life, believing it made them divine. In truth, it left them scarred, weakened, and trapped in rituals that celebrated pain as refinement. The shine of smooth skin hid a reality of wounds, making clear that beauty in their world was built on suffering disguised as elegance. Beeswax mixed with clay was used by Roman queens as a method of removing every trace of body hair, a process that promised smoothness, but left behind torn skin, bleeding pores, and long-lasting pain. The wax was heated until it softened into a thick, sticky paste, and powdered clay was stirred into it to give more grip. Servants carried the steaming bowls carefully into the bathing chambers, where the smell of warm wax filled the air. Queens reclined on couches or stools, robes removed, while attendants spread the mixture across arms, legs, and even the most intimate parts of the body. To the Roman mind, this was not cruelty but refinement, a ritual that marked status and discipline. The application itself was harsh. Attendants smeared the hot wax clay mixture across the skin with wooden spatulas, pressing firmly to make sure it adhered to every hair. The heat burned at first, raising gooseflesh and leaving red patches even before the removal began. Once the wax cooled and hardened, it was ripped away in swift motions. Clumps of hair came out together with layers of skin, leaving raw patches that stung immediately. The queens clenched their jaws, enduring in silence, for to cry out would mean weakness. It is almost laughable that a treatment leaving streaks of blood was celebrated as elegance, yet society praised those who endured it. The pain did not end when the wax was stripped away. Blood seeped from open follicles, soaking into linen cloths used to dab the skin. In some areas, particularly the thighs and groin, pores became inflamed, swelling into painful bumps that lingered for weeks. Infections were common as bacteria entered through the open wounds. Some women carried scars for life, their skin permanently marked by the ritual meant to make them smooth. Yet they continued, convinced that only by repeating the process could they preserve the illusion of divine perfection. The reasoning behind this method reflected cultural ideals of purity and control. Statues of goddesses showed skin without blemish or hair, carved to gleam in marble. Queens sought to imitate these forms, believing that hairlessness brought them closer to the divine. Body hair was associated with disorder, while smooth skin suggested discipline and superiority. To achieve this look, they sacrificed comfort and safety without hesitation. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like celebrating a spa that rips away chunks of skin alongside hair, and then advertising the wounds as proof of beauty. Attendants bore a heavy role in the process. They heated the wax, stirred the clay, and spread it evenly across delicate areas. Their hands were burned by splashes of hot wax, their arms strained from repeated ripping. The odour of clay and scorched hair filled their lungs, leaving them coughing as they worked. Some dreaded the ritual so much that they wrote later of the guilt they carried, knowing they inflicted harm on their mistresses. But refusal was not an option. Duty demanded obedience, and obedience meant pain. The chambers where these rituals occurred presented sharp contrasts. Golden lamps glowed on marble walls, incense smoke drifted through carved doorways, and silk drapes surrounded couches. Yet in the midst of this grandeur, women lay bleeding, their bodies covered in raw patches as attendants wiped away clots of hair and wax. The contradiction between luxury and suffering was hidden by silence. Outwardly, queens emerged radiant, their skins smooth for banquets and ceremonies. Inwardly, they carried sores, itching wounds, and exhaustion. Health consequences mounted with each session. Some queens developed chronic skin conditions, with repeated waxing leading to deep infections of the follicles. Physicians applied ointments made of herbs and oils, but these often worsened the irritation by clogging the already damaged pores. Fever sometimes followed, spreading through the body after bacteria entered the bloodstream. Yet the connection between the ritual and the illness was never admitted openly. To speak against the practice would mean defying the traditions of the court, and so silence prevailed. The scars of these practices were not only physical but cultural. Queens were judged by their appearance, praised for smoothness, and criticised for any trace of hair. This pressure ensured that the rituals continued, passed down to younger women entering the palace. Mothers instructed daughters, attendants trained replacements, and physicians stood aside. Pain became a standard part of beauty, embedded so deeply into the culture that few ever questioned it. I cannot help but feel disturbed when imagining these women forced to smile through gatherings, while beneath their robes their skin still oozing from wounds inflicted hours earlier. Archaeological evidence gives further weight to the accounts. Fragments of spatulas, bowls lined with wax residue, and traces of clay have been uncovered in Roman ruins. Statues themselves bear signs of this influence, with some depicting women with unnaturally smooth or even scarred surfaces, perhaps reflecting the cultural link between sacrifice and beauty. Writers of the time occasionally noted the rituals, though often in admiring tones, presenting endurance of pain as proof of nobility. The persistence of this practice shows how appearances ruled over truth. Smooth skin became a symbol of discipline, even when achieved through suffering that left the body weakened. The empire valued image above health, and women bore the cost in silence. In this way, beauty became not a gift but a burden, enforced through rituals that scarred as much as they polished. They spread hot wax mixed with clay across their bodies, ripping it away until skin tore and blood flowed, convinced that this brought them closer to perfection. What remained was not divine but damaged flesh, concealed beneath robes yet celebrated as proof of grace. Beyond these rituals lay even darker practices, where the demands of beauty blurred entirely with cruelty. The statues of Roman goddesses gleamed in marble, their surfaces smooth and flawless. Queens, seeking to mirror that ideal, accepted scars as proof of devotion. The blood shed in their chambers was quietly reframed as sacrifice, an unspoken currency of beauty. In this world, suffering was not hidden, but woven directly into the fabric of nobility. Human bones, reduced to ash and then ground into fine powder, became an ingredient in one of the most disturbing hygiene rituals of Roman queens. These remains were gathered from sources that are still debated by historians, some from battlefield cremations, others from graveyards where bones were collected in secret, and occasionally from executed criminals whose bodies were burned and recycled into what the elite believed was a cleansing agent. The powder was stored in small clay jars or bronze containers, often kept beside perfumes and oils, as though it belonged in the same category of refinement. To the queens, it was not morbid but necessary, an essential part of keeping their teeth bright and their breath acceptable. The preparation of the powder was gruesome. Bones were burned until brittle, then pounded with stone pestles until they became dust. The result was mixed with either wine, which was thought to purify and strengthen, or urine, which was believed to intensify the whitening effect. Attendants prepared the mixture each morning, dipping cloth strips or wooden sticks into the paste before handing them to their mistress. The queen would then scrub her teeth, grinding the gritty mixture against enamel that slowly wore thinner with every stroke. It is almost laughable that brushing with the remnants of the dead was considered elegant oral care, but in their world, tradition gave even ashes a noble purpose. The process itself was harsh. The grit scratched at the surface of the teeth, producing a sound like stone rubbing against stone. Queens felt their mouths fill with the taste of charred bone and sour liquid, but they persisted. To them, the burn and the roughness were proof that the mixture was working. Servants stood nearby with cloths to wipe away the foam that formed at the corners of the lips. After the scrubbing ended, the queen rinsed her mouth with more wine or water, spitting the mixture into bowls that were later dumped outside the palace walls. The chamber smelled faintly of scorched earth, a reminder of what had been used. The effects appeared impressive at first. Teeth took on a pale, chalky brightness that looked clean in the dim light of oil lamps. Courtiers praised the queens for their radiant smiles, believing the rituals kept them youthful. Yet beneath the surface, enamel thinned, cracks formed, and sensitivity grew unbearable. Gums swelled from the constant abrasion, bleeding at the touch of cloth. Infections took hold easily, spreading through mouths already weakened by poor diet and lack of true medical care. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like proudly advertising toothpaste made of sandpaper and ashes, then wondering why teeth fell out early. The reasoning behind the practice reflected Roman ideas about strength and purity. Bones were associated with permanence and vitality, so consuming or using their dust was thought to transfer these qualities. By scrubbing with bone powder, queens imagined they were fortifying their teeth with the essence of human strength. When combined with wine or urine, both of which carried their own symbolic powers, the mixture seemed a miraculous formula. The irony was brutal. What was believed to preserve actually destroyed. Attendants endured their own share of disgust. They handled the powders daily, breathing in dust that clung to their nostrils and throats. Some developed coughs or stomach complaints from exposure, but their complaints were silenced by duty. The jars they prepared carried the same solemnity as holy relics, even though the contents came from anonymous remains. Servants later wrote of the unease they felt, handling bones that once belonged to the dead, yet they pressed forward, ensuring their queens could maintain the illusion of beauty. The chambers where these rituals occurred were marked by contradiction. Fine mosaics decorated the walls, silver mirrors reflected lamplight, and incense burned in tall holders. Yet the central act was the grinding of teeth with bone dust, a routine that left mouths bleeding. Guests who saw the results praised the elegance of a queen's smile, without realizing that behind the lips lay rotting gums and fragile enamel. The empire was built on illusions, and this ritual was another piece of that illusion. Health consequences were severe, as enamel eroded, teeth became vulnerable to decay. Cavities spread, pain deepened, and abscesses formed that sometimes led to deadly infections. Queens who once smiled brightly ended their days with mouths full of missing teeth, their beauty undermined by the very practices meant to preserve it. Physicians applied poultices or recommended more wine rinses, but these offered little relief. The root of the problem was never questioned, because the ritual itself was untouchable. I cannot help but feel unsettled when imagining women of immense power grinding human bone into their mouths each morning, convinced it was a path to refinement. Archaeological evidence has confirmed parts of this practice. Traces of bone powder have been found in cosmetic jars buried with noblewomen, alongside dental tools made of bronze or wood. Written accounts from Roman writers also mention the use of ashes and powders for cleaning teeth, though they often described it with admiration rather than criticism. The reality, however, is revealed by the skeletal remains of women whose teeth show patterns of erosion and gum disease consistent with abrasive cleaning methods. The persistence of this custom reveals how deeply the Romans valued appearances over health. A radiant smile was worth infection, pain, and the loss of teeth. Smoothness and whiteness mattered more than strength or longevity. The same empire that built aqueducts and roads capable of lasting centuries also embraced rituals that destroyed bodies in the pursuit of fleeting ideals. They scoured their teeth with dust from the dead, mixing it with wine or urine, and called it purification. What remained was not health, but decay, hidden behind smiles that masked the suffering within. The brilliance of their appearance stood on the foundations of disease, another proof that beauty in their world was purchased with pain. The ritual of bone powder, so shocking to us now, was to them an ordinary part of daily life. It tells us not only of their obsession with appearance, but also of the power of tradition to blind people to harm. It is one more reminder that refinement in the Roman world often came dressed in decay. Their teeth gleamed with chalky whiteness, but beneath that surface, their gums festered and their mouths ached. In palaces where luxury ruled, death itself was turned into a tool of beauty. And from this morbid practice, the cycle of suffering continued, leading women further into rituals that blurred the line between care and cruelty. Blocks of ice were considered by Roman queens to be more than a luxury. They were treated as instruments of beauty and purity, though the way they were used brought only danger and pain. Ice was rare in Rome. It had to be carried from mountain peaks or imported at great cost, stored in insulated pits lined with straw and earth. When it reached the palaces, it was already precious, reserved for the highest in society. Instead of being used only for cooling wine or preserving food, part of it was dedicated to a ritual that promised freshness and tightness of the body. Queens believed that placing ice inside themselves would restore a sense of youth, purity, and allure. The preparation was both careful and humiliating. Servants retrieved small chunks of ice, their hands stiff from the cold, and wrapped them in thin cloths soaked in perfumed oils. These were presented to the queen in her private chambers. Attendants assisted her, often slaves chosen for their discretion, who were ordered to position the ice within the most intimate parts of the body. The cold was shocking, sending spasms through the flesh. Queens endured this in silence, their bodies trembling under layers of robes while servants waited quietly. It is almost ridiculous to think that women of immense power subjected themselves to such agony in the name of freshness. Yet tradition made it seem dignified. The effect was immediate. The freezing temperature caused muscles to contract sharply, creating a temporary tightness that was interpreted as renewed youth. But the risks were severe. Sensitive tissues were damaged by the cold, turning red, swollen, and sometimes tearing from the sudden contraction. Infections followed easily, as ice stored in unsanitary pits carried bacteria and dirt into the body. What began as a ritual of allure often ended in fevers and chronic pain. The smell of ice, faint but distinct, mixed with oils and perfumes during these ceremonies. Attendants fanned the air, though they could do little to ease the discomfort. Some slaves were ordered to hold the ice in place, their hands trembling as the cold seeped into their skin. For them, the humiliation was twofold: to endure the chill themselves and to participate in a ritual that harmed their mistress. Yet refusal was impossible. Their role was to obey, even when obedience meant suffering. The logic behind this ritual was tied to Roman ideals of control and purity. Ice, rare and exotic, was thought to carry divine powers. Its chill was interpreted as cleansing, a way to purify the body by shocking it back into a state of perfection. Queens believed that enduring the cold showed discipline, just as fasting or painful beauty rituals demonstrated virtue. The truth, however, was that cold destroyed delicate tissue, leaving scars both visible and hidden. If we compare this to modern practices, it would be like promoting frozen metal rods as luxury health devices and ignoring the injuries they cause. Servants dreaded their role in this ritual. They fetched ice from storage pits where it sat in the dark, covered in dirt and straw. They chipped away at blocks with knives, their hands numb, and carried the pieces quickly before they melted. They knew the ice was not clean, but they were forbidden from saying so. Instead, they obeyed, kneeling beside their mistress while holding objects so cold they burned. Some later wrote in secret of their shame, describing how the ritual left both queen and servant in silent misery. The environment where these rituals unfolded carried the same contradictions found in other Roman practices. Golden lamps glowed on polished marble, perfumed smoke rose from censers, and silken drapes surrounded the chambers. Yet in the midst of this luxury, women shivered in pain, their bodies violated by blocks of frozen water that symbolized status rather than care. Guests who later saw the queens could not know what had occurred in private. To them, the queens appeared radiant, but beneath the robes were scars left by frost. The consequences were serious. Some women suffered repeated infections, their health deteriorating over time. There are accounts suggesting that infertility followed these rituals, as damage to the womb became permanent. Physicians had little understanding of the harm, and rather than advising against it, they often prescribed more cleansing with herbs or oils to cover the symptoms. The true cause was never confronted, for to challenge the ritual was to challenge the authority of queenship itself. This practice also reflected the imbalance of power within the palace. Queens endured the pain in silence because they were expected to embody discipline and purity. Slaves carried the weight of enforcing it, their bodies chilled as they held ice in place. Neither group benefited, yet both were trapped by tradition and expectation. Pain was reframed as refinement, suffering as status. I cannot help but feel disturbed imagining women of the highest rank trembling with cold, convinced they were becoming pure, while the servants who assisted them trembled beside them for entirely different reasons. Archaeological traces support the existence of this practice. Storage pits for ice have been discovered, along with references in Roman texts to the use of ice for both culinary and cosmetic purposes. While the writings often praise the rarity of ice and its association with luxury, they do not dwell on the suffering it caused. The silence of these records reveals how deeply normalized pain had become in the name of beauty. The legacy of the ritual speaks volumes about Roman priorities. Ice, a rare and precious commodity, was wasted in ways that harmed the very bodies it was supposed to honor. Smoothness, tightness, and freshness were prized more than health or comfort. The empire valued appearances above reality, and queens bore the heaviest cost. They inserted ice into their bodies, believing it brought freshness and allure, but it left them scarred, infertile, and weakened. The luxury of cold, carried at great expense from distant mountains, became another weapon of tradition against the women who lived within the palace walls. In the name of beauty, even frost was turned into fire. The ritual ended in silence. The ice melted away, leaving water that trickled down and soaked into the robes. Yet its mark lingered, hidden within the body. In the empire's endless pursuit of control, even the chill of mountains was dragged into the chambers of queens, reshaped into an instrument of pain disguised as refinement. Wine, to the Romans, was more than a drink. It was a symbol of refinement, health, and power. So it is perhaps not surprising that queens believed it could be transformed into a tool of hygiene. But the practice of using wine mixed with poisonous herbs as an internal cleanser turned something celebrated into something destructive. Attendants prepared vessels filled with red or white wine, sometimes warmed slightly to feel soothing, and blended in roots or leaves of plants that carried strong, even toxic properties. These concoctions were poured into bronze or clay devices designed to push the liquid deep into the body. What was called purification of the womb was in reality a ritual of hidden injury. The process began in private chambers where incense masked the sour smell of the wine mixture. Servants knelt on tiled floors, holding jars and funnels, while the queen lay back on cushions. The liquid, heavy with sharp scents from roots like hellebore or other toxic plants, was introduced into her body, causing immediate stinging and burning. The sensation was interpreted as proof that the cleansing was working, a sign that impurities were being washed away. The truth was that tissue was being stripped raw, the cervix scarred, and bleeding often followed for days. It is almost laughable that noble women believed burning pain inside their bodies meant purification, when in fact it was destruction in disguise. Roman beliefs tied the womb to health, fertility, and even the stability of the household. Anything that promised to cleanse it was given legitimacy, no matter the cost. Physicians of the time spoke of stagnation and imbalance, suggesting that harmful fluids accumulated inside women. Wine, with its sharp bite, seemed the perfect antidote. By adding herbs, the mixture gained a mystical aura, as if secret knowledge had been captured in liquid form. What was considered wisdom was in fact a dangerous recipe that ensured long-term harm. The immediate effects were brutal. Some women fainted during the ritual, their bodies racked with cramps. Others screamed from the pain but were told it meant the treatment was effective. Servants cleaned up the blood that sometimes followed, dabbing at wounds with a cloth soaked in perfumes to hide the odour. Days later, fever could set in, signalling infection. Yet the ritual was repeated again and again, because the empire had convinced itself that suffering was the price of purity. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like promoting bleach as a luxury health tonic and congratulating those who endure the burns it leaves behind. Attendants suffered their own distress. They prepared the mixtures by grinding roots known to cause dizziness and weakness when inhaled. The fumes from boiling herbs in wine made them cough or feel faint, but silence was demanded. They carried the devices, poured the liquid, and wiped away the aftermath, all while pretending it was an act of service rather than cruelty. Their unease was buried beneath obedience, just as the queen's pain was buried beneath ritual. The chambers told a different story from reality. Golden lamps illuminated marble floors, draped fabric softened the room, and bowls of roses perfumed the air. Yet beneath that beauty, queens endured bleeding caused by toxic liquid forced into their bodies. Outwardly, they emerged calm, attending ceremonies and banquets as though untouched. Inwardly, they carried soreness, infections, and the creeping realization that fertility was slipping away. Long-term consequences were devastating. Scarring of the cervix, chronic infections, and lasting pain left some women unable to conceive. In a world where bearing heirs defined a queen's worth, infertility was both a personal tragedy and a political weapon. Yet the connection between the ritual and the outcome was whispered at best, never declared openly. To admit that the queen's body was damaged by tradition would be to admit that the empire itself had failed her, and so the silence grew heavier, covering wounds that never healed. The reasoning behind continuing was rooted in fear. Women feared impurity, men feared childlessness, and the court feared scandal. By clinging to the ritual, They could tell themselves that control still existed. Every drop of wine mixed with herbs became a symbol of discipline, an offering to both gods and society. But each ritual cut deeper, ensuring that bodies grew weaker and lineages suffered. I find it chilling to picture queens lying back with calm expressions while knowing their insides were burning. Proof of how far tradition can blind people to their own suffering. Evidence remains of this grim practice. Archaeological finds include vessels shaped specifically for pouring liquids deep into the body, their surfaces stained with traces of wine. Texts from Roman writers reference womb cleansing, often in approving tones, never acknowledging the risks. Skeletal remains of women show signs of pelvic infection, supporting the accounts of lasting harm. Even in death, the scars of ritual remained etched into their bones. The ritual stands as a stark reminder of how societies can twist necessity into torment. Cleanliness was a noble goal, but when combined with ignorance and superstition, it became a tool of destruction. The queens who endured these cleansings were victims of the very system that claimed to elevate them. Their bodies bore the proof, even when their voices could not. They poured wine mixed with poisonous herbs into themselves, believing it brought purity, while it quietly destroyed their health. Blood and fever followed, yet the empire looked away, seeing only the illusion of discipline. In the pursuit of perfection, queens were sacrificed slowly, their lives shortened by the very rituals meant to preserve them. The story of this ritual is not just about hygiene, but about silence and power. Pain was hidden, infertility concealed, and the truth never spoken. In the halls of Rome, appearances triumphed over reality, and women's bodies became battlegrounds for ideals that valued control more than care. Their wombs were burned by wine and poison, their futures stolen in the name of cleanliness. Yet the empire continued, pretending that such suffering was natural, even noble. Behind closed doors, queens bled in silence, while outside the marble walls, Rome celebrated its grandeur. Rainwater was not simply water to the Romans. When it fell from the sky and ran down the roofs of temples, it became a symbol of the gods themselves. Queens of Rome believed that bathing in this water once each month would cleanse their bodies and spirits. The ritual was performed with great ceremony, though the reality was far from divine. Rainwater was collected in stone basins and clay jars placed beneath the carved statues of gods. Whatever flowed down from the marble and bronze, dust, bird droppings, rotting leaves, or the corpses of insects, was gathered and stored as though it were the purest of offerings. When the time came for the monthly bath, the jars were carried into private chambers, their contents poured into basins large enough for a queen to sit in. What was celebrated as sacred was in fact a bath of filth. The act itself was layered with meaning. Queens disrobed in candlelit rooms where incense masked the sour smell of stagnant water. Attendants poured the contents of the jars into shallow marble tubs. The surface rippled with floating debris, bits of leaves softened by decay, wings of flies, fragments of stone dust. Still, the women lowered themselves into the basin, gasping as the cold touched their skin. They closed their eyes, convincing themselves that contact with the water of the gods renewed them. The reality was that grime clung to their skin, and tiny creatures brushed against their flesh. It is almost absurd that women of such wealth chose to soak in water laced with droppings and insects. Yet the ceremony made it seem like a privilege. The monthly rhythm of this practice was strictly observed. Missing the bath was seen as a sign of neglecting the gods, a failure of duty. Attendants marked the days carefully, ensuring that rainwater was always ready. When rains were scarce, water that had been stored for weeks was used, thickened by time, carrying the smell of rot. Yet the queens endured, telling themselves that what repulsed their senses was sacred. The devotion to appearance outweighed the reality of contamination. The effects on the body were predictable. Skin developed rashes from the bacteria carried in the water. Cuts and small wounds became infected. turning red and swollen. Some women complained of itching that lasted for days, but physicians dismissed it as harmless, claiming it was proof the cleansing had taken hold. Fevers occasionally followed, but they too were folded into the story of purification. To question the ritual was to question the gods, and such doubt was unthinkable. If we compare this to today, it would be like insisting that bathing in gutter water collected from a cathedral roof was a health treatment, and praising the sores that followed as signs of success. The attendants faced their own struggles. They climbed ladders to place jars beneath temple statues, often slipping on wet stone. They carried the heavy vessels through crowded streets, the water sloshing with every step. By the time it reached the palace, it was far from clean, but the servants dared not say so. Their hands grew raw from handling the slimy jars, their lungs filled with the sour smell of stagnant rain. Yet obedience bound them, just as pain bound their mistresses. The chambers where these baths occurred were decorated with grandeur. Marble tiles gleamed beneath lamplight, bronze braziers glowed, and perfumed smoke curled through the air. Against this backdrop, queens sat in shallow pools of foul water, their bodies shivering as cold seeped into their bones. From the outside, the ritual seemed holy. From within, it was a miserable endurance test dressed in sacred robes. The health consequences were not hidden. Infections of the skin and bladder became common. Rashes spread across thighs and arms, sometimes leaving scars. Some women fell gravely ill, their bodies weakened by repeated exposure to contaminated water. But in the silence of the palace, these consequences were reframed as divine trials. Pain was presented as proof of devotion, and devotion excused the harm. I cannot help but feel unsettled when imagining queens, surrounded by golden lamps and silken curtains, lowering themselves into basins of filth while believing they were ascending toward purity. Evidence of this practice lingers in both archaeology and text. Drainage systems in temples show signs of deliberate collection, channels carved to guide rainwater into basins. Writings describe the use of this water for rituals, praising it as a gift from the gods. Nowhere do they mention the debris that surely filled it, the insects that drowned in it, or the diseases it spread. Silence was safer than honesty, for honesty would break the illusion of holiness. The persistence of this monthly bath reveals how tradition binds even the most powerful. Queens could command armies and influence politics, yet they could not escape the expectation of this ritual. To skip it was to risk whispers of impurity, to appear unworthy in the eyes of the court. So they endured, month after month, offering their bodies to a practice that harmed them while cloaking itself in divine legitimacy. They bathed in rainwater that carried rot, convincing themselves it was holy. Their skin burned with rashes, their bodies weakened by hidden infections, yet they emerged from the basins wrapped in silks, praised as symbols of divine beauty. The empire valued appearances more than health, and queens paid the price in silence. The story of this ritual captures the contradiction of Roman life, the blending of grandeur with decay, of holiness with filth. It shows how power can bend perception until even contamination is seen as purity. It is a reminder that what shines on the surface often hides sickness beneath. They sat in cold basins filled with sacred filth, whispering prayers as insects floated around them. Their attendants bowed, their courtiers praised, and the empire turned away from the truth. In the halls of Rome, even the gods' water carried decay, and still it was celebrated. Menstruation in the Roman world was not spoken of openly, yet it shaped the daily lives of queens in ways both hidden and harmful. Instead of safe or hygienic methods, women were expected to conceal the process with whatever materials were available, and in the palaces, these materials often came from the most unsettling of sources. Strips of old cloth were cut and repurposed, sometimes taken from garments no longer used, and in some cases from the clothing of deceased slaves. These strips were folded and layered into crude pads, tucked beneath linen garments and worn for days at a time. The idea was not to care for the body, but to hide it, to keep the natural cycle unseen. The problem was that these makeshift cloths were rarely washed properly. Laundering in ancient Rome was harsh, involving strong chemicals like lye or ammonia from urine, substances that could corrode fabric but not fully clean it. Some clothes were simply rinsed in water and left to dry in the sun, still carrying stains and bacteria. Queens, bound by expectation to appear untouchable, continued to wear these reused pads even when they caused irritation and infection. It is almost absurd that women of such status wrapped themselves in rags unfit for servants. Yet silence about menstruation made even filth seem acceptable. The odour was impossible to ignore. Without frequent changing, the clothes grew heavy and damp, releasing a sour smell that perfumes and incense could not mask. Servants noticed, but they dared not speak. Instead, they quietly burned incense sticks in chambers, sprayed oils on robes, or sprinkled crushed herbs onto the garments of their mistresses. The smell became part of palace life, lingering in rooms where queens sat in silence. When cloth was scarce, other substitutes were used. Leaves were rolled and stuffed as pads, their edges sharp enough to scrape delicate skin. Straw, wool, or even papyrus fibres were tried, each carrying its own discomforts. These measures caused cuts and rashes that quickly became infected. Yet poverty of solutions and the weight of tradition kept women tied to these practices. What was framed as modest concealment was in truth a steady march toward disease. If we compare this to today, it would be like insisting women use old funeral garments or leaves from the garden as sanitary products, then pretending the infections that followed were simply fate. Servants bore a heavy burden in this cycle. They collected old fabrics, cut them into strips, and delivered them discreetly to their mistresses. Afterward, they cleaned the soiled cloths, rinsing them in buckets of water until their hands were raw. Some grew sick from constant exposure, their skin breaking out in rashes from the filth. Still, they carried out their duties with bowed heads, for to refuse was unthinkable. Their suffering became invisible, folded into the same silence that concealed the queen's discomfort. The chambers of ritual concealment were marked by contradiction. On the outside, queens appeared radiant in embroidered robes, their bodies adorned with jewels. Inside those same garments lay strips of stained cloth, already breeding infection. The contrast was never spoken of, but it existed in every banquet hall, every ceremony, every procession. Outward purity masked inward decay, a reflection of Rome itself. The health effects were severe. Infections spread quickly, rising from irritated skin to the uterus itself. Women developed fevers, pain, and in some cases lifelong damage to fertility. Chronic odours and discharge followed, signs of illness that were ignored or dismissed as natural weakness. Physicians of the time offered little help, prescribing more incense, herbs, or even ritual cleansing with wine, remedies that treated symptoms but not the cause. I cannot help but feel deeply unsettled imagining queens smiling through ceremonies while beneath their robes, infection festered from rags tied against their bodies. Archaeological traces hint at this practice. Strips of cloth stained with organic material have been found in Roman sites, some too coarse to have served as anything other than makeshift pads. Texts describe women using rags or wool to manage their cycles, though always with euphemisms that soften the truth. The silence of records reflects the taboo surrounding menstruation, a subject wrapped in shame that hid the harm it caused. The persistence of this ritual reveals the strength of cultural silence. By forcing women to conceal their cycles, Rome ensured that harmful practices continued unchallenged. Queens had the wealth to demand better, yet they were bound by expectations of modesty and secrecy. To speak openly of menstruation would have been scandalous, so they endured in silence. They wrapped themselves in cloth once worn by the dead, endured the smell, the rashes, and the infections, all to appear untouched by something natural. The empire praised their composure, never acknowledging the hidden suffering beneath. What was framed as dignity was in reality decay. This story is not only about hygiene but also about control. It shows how silence and shame can force even the most powerful to endure indignities that destroy health. It shows how appearance can matter more than care, how concealment can become more important than truth. Queens walked into banquets and ceremonies wrapped in silks, yet beneath those silks lay the weight of filth. They carried it without complaint, because complaint was forbidden, and in that silence, tradition triumphed over health, leaving scars invisible to history but etched deeply into their bodies. They hid their cycles with rags, endured infection, and bore the pain in silence, while Rome celebrated its grandeur. In this world, even blood was forced into secrecy, and secrecy ensured that the suffering continued. Small pouches of sheep's wool, carried close to the body, were once believed to protect Roman queens from illness and impurity. These pouches, sewn from scraps of linen or soft leather, were filled with clumps of wool cut from sheep, sometimes mixed with crushed herbs. The idea was simple, wool-absorbed sweat, and with sweat, it supposedly drew away harmful vapours. The practice reflected the Roman belief that sickness was carried in miasma, invisible clouds of bad air that clung to the body. If the wool grew heavy and foul, it meant it was working. What looked like filth was praised as protection, and so queens wore these pouches pressed against their chests, tucked beneath robes, or pinned to their undergarments. At first, the wool absorbed moisture easily. After hours in hot chambers, during long ceremonies, or beneath heavy robes, sweat soaked the pouches until they were damp. The smell began faintly, a sour odour rising each time the pouch was pressed against the skin. Yet instead of changing them, queens and their attendants clung to the belief that the worse they smelled, the more they had absorbed. Pouches were kept in place for days, then weeks, carried so close to the body that they became extensions of the flesh itself. It is almost laughable that decay hanging against the skin was seen as a charm of health. Yet faith in superstition made rot into a treasure. The wool did not simply hold sweat. Over time, it began to decompose, its fibres turning dark and sticky, mixed with body heat, perfume oils, and dirt. The pouches transformed into breeding grounds for bacteria. The odour grew stronger, clinging not only to the queens but to the chambers they occupied. Attendants discreetly burned incense or scattered flower petals to mask it, but the foulness lingered. Court rituals demanded composure, so queens smiled through feasts and processions even while carrying rotting wool pressed against their bodies. The health consequences soon followed. Damp wool irritated the skin, rubbing raw patches that became sores. Infections took hold, spreading beneath the surface, sometimes causing abscesses that leaked pus. Fever rose without explanation, and physicians prescribed more herbs or purges, never considering that the culprit lay in the pouch itself. The wool, believed to draw away poison, instead introduced it back into the body. If we compare this to modern habits, it would be like placing mouldy sponges inside one's clothing to stay healthy, then praising the infections they cause as signs of success. Attendants bore the unpleasant duty of maintaining the pouches. They removed them when commanded, though this was rare, and tried to dry them by the fire or in the sun. The smell grew stronger during these attempts, filling rooms with the stench of sour sweat and decaying wool. Servants who handled the pouches often developed rashes on their hands, their skin reacting to the filth. Still, they obeyed. In the hierarchy of the palace, even rotting objects were treated as sacred if queens believed in their power. The chambers of ritual once again revealed contradiction. Golden mosaics gleamed on walls, silver vessels held wine, and marble floors shone under torchlight. Yet within this splendour, women pressed pouches of filth against their chests, convinced it preserved them. Guests who approached close enough to smell might wrinkle their noses, but they dared not speak. Silence and superstition were stronger than truth. In some cases, the wool pouches caused lasting harm. Historical accounts mention noble women who suffered festering wounds across their chests, the result of constant friction and infection. One archaeological discovery described a female skeleton, likely of noble rank, with signs of severe chest infection and decay. Alongside her remains lay traces of cloth and wool pressed into lumps, evidence that these pouches were buried with her as though they were protective talismans. I find it deeply disturbing to imagine queens of immense wealth dying slowly from infections caused by rotting wool, while those around them praised their devotion to ritual. The persistence of the practice was fueled by belief in humours and balance. Sweat was seen not only as waste but as danger, carrying away vital forces. Capturing it in wool seemed a way to manage it, keeping the body stable and the soul pure. But the misunderstanding turned sweat into poison. Each day of wearing the pouch was another day of feeding bacteria, another step toward decline. The symbolism of the wool itself mattered. Sheep were seen as sacred animals, connected to sacrifice and purity. Their wool carried connotations of warmth and protection. To wear it close to the skin was to wear the essence of purity. Queens wrapped themselves in this belief, never admitting that the same purity rotted quickly when trapped in cloth. The wool's sacred meaning masked its physical corruption. The result was a cycle of faith and decay. Queens trusted the pouches, attendants obeyed, physicians overlooked, and the empire admired. No one broke the silence, and so the pouches remained, pressed against skin until they became part of death itself. In this way, superstition not only guided behaviour but claimed lives. They pressed rotting wool against their skin, believing it drew away poison, while in truth it poisoned them more deeply. Their health weakened, their bodies scarred, and yet the empire looked on and praised their discipline. In Rome, even the smell of decay could be reframed as holiness. The story of this ritual is not only about hygiene but about illusion. It shows how power and tradition can twist objects into symbols, even when they cause harm. It reminds us that wealth does not protect against ignorance, and that superstition can triumph even in gilded halls. They carried sweat-soaked wool in their garments until it rotted, smiling in public while their skin broke down beneath. The empire celebrated its poise, never seeing the infection hidden behind silk robes. In the palaces of Rome, beauty and rot lived side by side, stitched into the same pouch. Toenails, though often ignored today, carried symbolic weight in the world of Roman queens. Some believed that allowing them to grow long and untouched created a mystical bond with the earth itself. The practice was framed as a way of absorbing natural energy, channeling the power of the soil, and grounding the body in divine strength. Queens were told that cutting their nails severed this connection, and so they let them extend far beyond ordinary length. The nails became thick, yellowed, and curled, pressing against sandals and leaving marks on fine leather shoes. Rather than being seen as unsightly, these deformities were praised as signs of devotion and closeness to the gods. The process began simply the avoidance of trimming. Attendants were instructed never to bring knives near the queen's feet, no matter how unsightly the growth became. At first, this decision seemed harmless. The nails lengthened gradually, covering the tips of toes like shields. But over weeks and months, the nails hardened, turning brittle, their edges catching on fabric or scraping the insides of sandals. Dust collected beneath them, trapped alongside fragments of food, soil, and insects that crept across palace floors. It is almost laughable that filth caught under curling toenails was framed as spiritual strength, yet belief made ugliness into holiness. As the nails thickened, fungus found a home within them. The pale surface darkened to shades of green or black, layers building one upon another until the nails seemed like slabs of stone. Small insects sometimes became trapped beneath, their bodies pressed flat and left to rot. The smell was faint but unmistakable, a musty odour that attendants recognised instantly. Still, nothing was done. The nails were sacred, a connection to the earth, and to touch them with a blade would break that bond. Attendants bore the unpleasant duty of cleaning around the nails without cutting them. They soaked the queen's feet in basins of perfumed water, scrubbing gently at the skin but never daring to disturb the nails themselves. The basins quickly filled with floating flakes of keratin, dirt, and insect remains. These were scooped away discreetly, while incense was burned to mask the odour. Servants often recoiled at the sight but said nothing. To speak against the practice was to risk punishment, for it was wrapped in the authority of tradition. The health effects were predictable. Long nails pressed into neighbouring toes, cutting into the skin and leaving open wounds. These wounds became infected, swelling into painful abscesses that made walking difficult. Queens endured the discomfort silently, for limping was more acceptable than breaking a ritual. Physicians were summoned only when the pain grew unbearable, and even then, their remedies were limited to herbs and poultices applied around the nails. The true cause, unchecked growth, remained untouched. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like insisting that athletes perform while wearing shoes filled with rotting wood, praising their endurance while ignoring the harm. The symbolism of the earth added weight to the ritual. Romans revered the soil as a source of fertility and life. By leaving toenails uncut, queens were thought to draw in that fertility, embodying the connection between land and lineage. Each curled nail became a talisman, a visible marker of their bond with divine forces. The uglier and more painful the nails became, the stronger the proof of devotion appeared. In the palaces, this contradiction was hidden beneath grandeur. Queens sat upon marble thrones, their robes trailing across polished floors, while beneath the fabric their feet carried nails thick with filth. Guests bowed, praised their grace, and never suspected the decay hidden inside fine sandals. The empire's obsession with appearances allowed these deformities to remain unchallenged. Outward beauty concealed inward shame. Attendants, however, could not escape the reality. They trimmed fabric to prevent snagging, adjusted sandals to fit swollen feet, and endured the smell when washing basins filled with debris. Some developed skin rashes from constant contact with contaminated water. Others grew ill, their immune systems overwhelmed by the bacteria that thrived in the queen's untreated feet. Their misery mirrored their mistress's, though in silence. Archaeological evidence supports the likelihood of such practices. Skeletal remains of noble women reveal deformed toe bones consistent with years of pressure from overgrown nails. Descriptions from Roman writers hint at customs of earthly connection, though always in cryptic language that praised endurance rather than addressing hygiene. Together, these traces point to a ritual that turned something mundane into something sacred, even as it caused harm. The persistence of this custom highlights how deeply superstition can override care. The belief that nails drew power from the earth was so strong that no amount of pain or decay could dislodge it. Women of immense wealth, who could command perfumes, jewels, and silks, were denied the simple relief of trimmed nails. Their suffering was reframed as virtue, their deformities disguised as proof of divine favour. I cannot help but feel disturbed imagining a queen limping through a palace ceremony, her sandals filled with the stench of rot, while the crowd applauded her grace. In the end, the ritual of uncut toenails reveals the paradox of Roman ideals. Cleanliness and purity were praised, yet filth was embraced when cloaked in sacred meaning. Health was sacrificed for the illusion of connection, and pain was endured in silence. The empire built its greatness on such contradictions, where grandeur covered decay and tradition excused suffering. They allowed their nails to grow long and foul, believing they were drawing power from the earth. Beneath silks and gold, their toes festered, swollen and bleeding, yet no one dared to question the practice. In this way, even nails became instruments of superstition, binding queens to rituals that destroyed them while claiming to elevate them. Their feet, hidden beneath layers of fabric and leather, carried the weight of decay, a burden disguised as holiness. Each step pressed the infection deeper, and each ceremony celebrated their endurance. In Rome's palaces, power was measured not in relief from pain, but in the ability to carry it with silence. Snake droppings, once dried and powdered, became a surprising ingredient in the beauty routines of Roman queens. The waste was collected, sometimes from snakes kept within palace grounds, or supplied by traders who brought exotic animals to the city. It was left to dry until brittle, then crushed into a fine dust and mixed with white powders like chalk or ground minerals. This mixture was then applied to the face as rouge for the cheeks, or as a pale base layer across the skin. The texture was gritty, the colour uneven, but in dim candlelight it gave the illusion of smoothness. What clung to the queen's faces was less a cosmetic than a layer of decay disguised as refinement. The application was handled by attendants who spread the powder carefully with cloth pads or soft brushes made of animal hair. They dabbed it across the cheeks, forehead, and chin, building up layers until the queen's complexion appeared uniform. The smell, however, betrayed the source. Even when mixed with oils or perfumes, the faint odour of waste lingered. Queens carried it into banquets and ceremonies, smiling beneath veils of fragrance that never fully masked the stench. It is almost ridiculous that waste from snakes, animals feared for their venom, was praised as a tool of beauty, yet belief transformed filth into elegance. The reasoning behind this ritual rested on symbolism as much as appearance. Snakes were linked to rebirth and transformation, shedding their skins and emerging anew. By applying their remains, even their waste, queens imagined they were borrowing that power, rejuvenating their own faces with the essence of renewal. The white tint created by the mixture also matched ideals of beauty, where pale skin suggested purity and status. What people saw was a mask of health, even while the skin beneath it suffered. The effects on the body were often harmful. The powder clogged pores, trapping sweat and dirt against the skin. Rashes formed, pimples swelled, and infections spread across cheeks and jaws. In some cases, sores broke open, leaving scars that no amount of powder could hide. Still, queens endured, layering more powder on top of the damage. Pain was reframed as progress, and progress was celebrated as beauty. If we compare this to today, it would be like grinding dried animal waste into face powder and then selling it as luxury makeup in golden jars. Attendants carried the weight of this ritual. They gathered the droppings, dried them in the sun, and ground them into powder with pestles. The dust filled the air, clinging to their nostrils and throats until they coughed. Their hands smelled of decay, no matter how often they washed, yet they pressed forward, spreading the mixture across their mistress's face with the same care as they would with perfume or jewels. Their silence kept the ritual alive, just as their labour made it possible. The environment where this routine unfolded was marked by contradiction. Marble floors gleamed, golden lamps glowed, and perfumes drifted through the air. Yet within that splendour, queens sat while their faces were coated in powder made of waste. The empire valued appearances so deeply that the origin of the cosmetic was ignored. Buried beneath layers of ceremony and fragrance, outward elegance masked inward decay, a theme repeated endlessly in Roman life. The long-term consequences grew worse. Continuous use of the powder eroded skin health, leaving permanent discoloration and scars. Some queens reportedly suffered chronic skin infections, their faces marked by the very substance meant to perfect them. Physicians prescribed more oils or herbs, but they never challenged the ritual itself. Beauty, once again, was valued above truth, and harm was hidden beneath veils of perfume. I cannot help but feel unsettled imagining women of immense power attending banquets with faces coated in snake waste, praised for radiance while beneath the powder, their skin festered. Archaeological evidence gives glimpses of this practice. Cosmetic jars bearing residue of mixed powders have been unearthed, their contents showing traces of organic material. Written accounts mention the use of unusual ingredients in cosmetics, including animal byproducts. These traces, though faint, confirm that beauty in Rome was not limited to perfumes and oils, but extended into practices that blurred the line between refinement and filth. The persistence of the ritual highlights how symbolism can outweigh reality. Snake droppings, meaningless in themselves, became powerful when linked to ideas of rebirth and purity. Queens clung to the belief that by painting their faces with it, they embodied the strength of transformation. The empire praised them for their composure and glow, never admitting that the glow came from sickness as much as ceremony. They powdered their faces with dried waste, smiling beneath a mask of decay. The smell followed them into halls and gardens, a whisper of truth that incense could never fully hide. Yet Rome celebrated them as paragons of beauty, proof that appearances ruled over honesty. The story of this ritual reveals how deeply culture can twist perception. What should have been rejected as foul was elevated as sacred, turned into a mark of status. It shows how the human desire for renewal can blind even the most powerful to danger. Their faces, pale and powdered, shone in lamplight, but beneath the layer of snake droppings lay sores, rashes, and infection. Still, they endured, because endurance was demanded, and because beauty was defined not by health, but by illusion. Sheep's brains, soft and fatty, were never intended by nature to freshen the breath, yet in the palaces of ancient Rome they were crushed, mixed with oil, and placed into the mouths of queens as though they were pearls of refinement. The practice grew from the belief that animal essence carried vitality, and that by holding it close, one could borrow its strength. In this case, brains were seen as carriers of purity and renewal, and when combined with olive oil and scented herbs, they became a strange remedy for bad breath. Attendants prepared the mixture daily, grinding the brains until they formed a paste, then stirring it into jars of oil infused with spices. The resulting substance smelled faintly of iron and decay, even beneath the layers of fragrance meant to disguise it. Queens were told to swish it in their mouths each morning, coating their teeth and gums with a mixture of fat, oil, and perfume. The process was unpleasant from the beginning. The paste clung to the tongue, its greasy texture coating the mouth in a film that resisted swallowing. The flavour was sharp and metallic, a combination of blood and herbs that made the stomach churn. Yet queens endured, told that the burning in their throats meant the cure was working. They rinsed for several minutes, attendants timing the ritual, before spitting into bronze bowls held discreetly nearby. The bowls reeked after use, their contents quickly carried away to be dumped outside palace walls. It is almost laughable that women of immense wealth gargled with sheep's brains each morning, believing it would keep their breath sweet, yet the empire applauded their refinement. The logic behind this ritual drew from Roman ideas of vitality. The brain was seen as the seat of life, the organ that directed thought and breath alike. By grinding it into oil, physicians claimed they were distilling essence itself. The addition of herbs, mint, anise, or myrrh, was meant to cover the foulness while enhancing the illusion of freshness. Olive oil, considered sacred and purifying, acted as the base that carried the whole concoction. Together, they promised to transform foul breath into royal fragrance, but in reality, the mixture introduced bacteria and fat into the mouth, attacking the gums and weakening the teeth. The results were immediate and troubling. Gums grew inflamed, swelling with every rinse. Teeth loosened, roots weakened by constant exposure to fats that seeped into crevices. The metallic tang clung to the breath, mixing with the herbs to create a scent neither fresh nor sweet. Some queens developed chronic sores in their mouths, raw patches that refused to heal, yet the practice continued, because custom dictated it and appearance demanded it. If we compare this to modern life, It would be like rinsing every morning with spoiled meat blended in mouthwash, then proudly claiming it gave you confidence. Attendants suffered as well. They handled the raw brains, cutting them from carcasses delivered to the palace. The work was grisly, their hands slick with tissue and fat. They ground the material with stone mortars, the paste sticking to tools and producing a rancid smell. Some became nauseated, others fainted, but the task was unavoidable. Their duty was to present the mixture as though it were perfume, even when their own faces betrayed disgust. Servants described the stench clinging to their clothes, following them long after they left the chambers. The ritual setting offered a sharp contrast. Marble floors shone, silver vessels sparkled, and incense filled the air. Yet in the centre of this grandeur, queens swirled sheep's brains in their mouths, eyes closed as though enduring a sacred act. Outwardly, the chambers presented beauty and power. Inwardly, they reeked of decay. The empire thrived on such contradictions, where filth could be rebranded as elegance with enough ceremony. The long-term consequences were severe. Repeated rinsing eroded gum tissue, leaving teeth unstable. Bacteria from raw animal matter entered open sores, spreading infections that sometimes turned fatal. Some queens were recorded as losing their teeth prematurely, their smiles collapsing into ruin long before old age. Physicians treated the symptoms, offering more herbs, more oils, but never challenged the ritual itself. For them, tradition was stronger than truth. I cannot help but feel disturbed imagining women praised for their composure, while beneath their lips their mouths burned with sores caused by sheep's brains. Evidence of this practice appears in both text and artifact. Roman writers described odd remedies for bad breath, some involving animal parts. Archaeologists have found small jars with residues of fat and herbal oils, likely used for oral care. Most striking are statues and burial goods that depict or contain small containers resembling spittoons or mouth-rinse vessels. These suggest that such practices were not isolated but common enough to leave traces across time. The persistence of this remedy reveals how much Rome valued appearances. Breath was a marker of refinement. Foul odour suggested weakness or corruption. Queens could not risk such associations, so they endured whatever ritual promised freshness. In truth, they sacrificed health for illusion, coating their mouths in decay disguised as care. They swished sheep's brains each morning, telling themselves it was the essence of purity. Their gums swelled, their teeth loosened, their breath turned stranger rather than sweeter, but they carried on in silence. The empire demanded composure, and composure was delivered, no matter the cost. The story of this ritual is not simply about hygiene. It is about the weight of expectation. Queens endured degradation to maintain appearances, their suffering hidden beneath perfume and jewels. It is a reminder that even in halls of power, silence can turn poison into tradition. Their mouths carried the taste of rot, yet their smiles were praised as royal. The bowls into which they spat reeked of fat and herbs, yet they were treated as vessels of refinement. In Rome, even decay was reborn as elegance, provided no one dared to tell the truth. Honey, in the Roman imagination, carried divine qualities. It was sweet, golden, and eternal, said to never spoil. So it is little wonder that queens believed it could be used to cleanse the body. Among the strangest applications was the practice of spreading honey over the most intimate areas, a ritual framed as protection against disease and decay. To the Romans, honey was thought to be a natural antiseptic, capable of sealing wounds and driving away corruption. Attendants prepared bowls of thick, amber liquid, sometimes mixed with herbs or oils, and brought them into private chambers where queens underwent the ritual. What was celebrated as a method of purity, however, often ended in discomfort, odour, and infestations that mock the very idea of refinement. The process itself was slow and humiliating. Servants warmed the honey until it loosened, its scent thick and cloying in the air. They carried it in bronze bowls, pouring it onto cloths or directly spreading it by hand over the skin of their mistresses. Queens reclined as the sticky layer coated them, covering delicate areas until movement became difficult. At first, the sensation was soothing, the honey cool and heavy, giving the illusion of protection. But as hours passed, it reacted with sweat, turning sour, fermenting against the heat of the body. It is almost laughable that rotting sugar pressed against the body was hailed as a cure. Yet Rome praised the women who endured it. Once applied, the honey seeped into folds of skin, clinging to hair and trapping dust. Perfume was sometimes sprinkled over it, but fragrance could not disguise the sour odour that soon developed. The queens bore this in silence, convinced that the discomfort was evidence of cleansing. Attendants were ordered to leave the coating in place for hours, sometimes overnight, until it hardened into a crust that had to be peeled away in clumps. What remained beneath was often reddened flesh, irritated and raw from the constant moisture. The health effects were severe. Fermented honey became a breeding ground for bacteria and yeast, causing infections that spread quickly in the warm environment. Skin broke out in rashes, sores formed, and itching became unbearable. Some women developed chronic conditions that lingered for years, yet the ritual persisted. To abandon it would mean admitting weakness, a confession that no queen could afford. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like coating the body with syrup every day and celebrating the swarm of insects it attracted as proof of success. The insects were perhaps the most visible consequence. Ants, flies, and even bees were drawn to the scent, invading chambers where queens lay coated in honey. Attendants fanned the air desperately, waving cloths to keep the creatures away, but it was a losing battle. On some occasions, insects became trapped directly against the skin, their bodies sticking until they died. The queens endured in silence, bearing the humiliation of becoming living altars to sweetness turned rancid. The palace air filled with the buzzing of flies and the sickly perfume of honey, a combination that no incense could erase. Servants suffered as well. They cleaned away the hardened crusts of honey, their hands sticking to cloths and bowls long after the ritual ended. They scraped residues from marble floors where it had dripped, fighting the stubborn stains. Many grew sick of the smell, their stomachs turning as they carried away cloths soaked with fermenting liquid. Yet they obeyed, as silence was safer than truth. The chambers of ritual, as always, were filled with contradiction. Golden lamps cast warm light over polished marble. Musicians sometimes played softly in the background, and perfumes wafted through the air. Yet in the centre of this splendour, queens lay coated in honey that dripped and fermented, their skin crawling with insects. Outwardly, they were praised for their devotion to cleanliness. Inwardly, they endured sores and humiliation. The symbolism of honey added strength to the practice. Romans saw bees as divine workers, and honey as their sacred gift. To spread it on the body was to borrow its purity, to seal oneself in the sweetness of the gods. But the sweetness rotted quickly, and what clung to queens was not purity but decay. The contradiction was ignored because tradition demanded silence. Long-term harm followed many who endured the ritual. Infections of the reproductive tract were common, leading to chronic pain and even infertility. Scarring sometimes develops, and the tissue is permanently damaged. Yet the empire continued to demand endurance, praising queens for their composure even while their health crumbled. Physicians offered no relief beyond more herbs, more oils, more honey, deepening the cycle of suffering. I cannot help but feel unsettled imagining a woman of immense power reduced to lying in silence while ants crawled across her body, all because tradition told her this was holy. Archaeological traces confirm the importance of honey in Roman life. Pots with residues of the substance have been uncovered in tombs, some mixed with herbs or oils, suggesting cosmetic or ritual use. Texts describe honey as both food and medicine, praised for its sweetness and longevity. The silence of these records about their dangers in hygiene rituals reflects how taboo it was to question practices tied to symbolism. The persistence of the honey ritual reveals the empire's obsession with appearances. Sweetness and fragrance mattered more than truth, purity more than comfort. Queens bore the weight of these expectations. Their bodies turned into testaments of endurance. What was framed as protection became another form of suffering hidden behind silk robes and golden crowns. They coated themselves in honey, convinced it would preserve purity, while in truth it lured insects and bred disease. Their chambers echoed with buzzing flies, their skin burned with sores, yet they smiled through ceremonies as though untouched. The empire's demand for composure ensured silence triumphed over honesty. The story of this ritual shows how far belief can twist perception. What should have been rejected as foul became celebrated as sacred. It is a reminder that luxury often hides rot, and that even the sweetest of substances can become poison when bound by ignorance. They turned honey into a prison, sealing themselves in sweetness that decayed into filth. Their suffering was ignored, their bodies weakened, and still Rome praised their devotion. In this world, even sugar could become a tool of torment. In the marble halls of Roman palaces, one could notice a curious habit if they looked down. Shoes that should have been replaced long ago were kept on noble women's feet until they nearly fell apart. The belief was that the leather carried a blessing, that each step left behind a trace of divine protection. Worn soles, cracked seams, and torn straps did not matter if the shoe was linked to a goddess or guardian spirit. To remove or discard it was thought to sever that connection. The shoes themselves were made from leather, often stiff and darkened with age. Instead of being polished, they carried stains of sweat and dirt. Inside, the lining was rough and never fully dried. Women walked through corridors and courtyards with dampness pressed against their skin. The smell built slowly, seeping into the air of enclosed rooms. It is ironic that something considered sacred by them would be considered garbage by anyone today. Feet trapped inside these relics grew soft, then cracked, then diseased. The constant dampness caused swelling. Fungal growth spread between the toes. When the skin broke, infections settled in, forming sores that did not heal. Still, the shoes were not taken off. They were bound to the idea that to change them was to betray divine favour. Priests and attendants encouraged this belief, repeating that the gods watched each step. The practice was not limited to the poorest or most ignorant. Queens, princesses, and high priestesses endured the same. They walked through temples, leaving behind not only sweat but the stench of rot. Courtiers and slaves trailed behind, catching every whiff. The irony was that these women bathed in perfumes, wore jewellery of gold, and painted their faces carefully. Yet beneath all this splendour, their feet were in decay. If compared to today, it would be like a celebrity wearing designer clothes while refusing to change socks for months. Servants were the ones most affected. They knelt to fasten straps or massage swollen feet. Their hands touched cracked leather soaked with pus and blood. They noticed when a nail turned black or when skin peeled away, yet they could not speak. To question the ritual was to question the gods. Silence was easier, even when the stench clung to their clothes and followed them home. Doctors of the time sometimes recorded such cases. They noted thickened nails, distorted toes, and flesh eaten away by infection. Remedies were suggested, from herbal poultices to hot ash compresses. Yet these were rarely applied, for treatment would require removing the sacred shoe. The symbol of devotion outweighed the promise of health. I cannot help but feel disturbed imagining the marble floors echoing with footsteps that left behind both reverence and decay. As days stretched into weeks, the shoes stiffened further. The leather cracked into sharp edges that cut into flesh. Each step was painful, but the pain itself was seen as part of the offering. Enduring it meant proving loyalty to divine will. Some claimed the limp that followed was a mark of honour, a sign of spiritual endurance. In truth, it was an infection travelling deeper into the body. The smell spread beyond the body. In banquet halls and bedrooms, the odour lingered. Incense was burned constantly, perfumes applied heavily, and flowers scattered in corners, yet nothing fully concealed it. Guests smiled politely, but their eyes sometimes betrayed discomfort. Within the hierarchy of power, no one dared address what everyone sensed. In private chambers, shoes were sometimes placed beneath altars when not worn. They were never cleaned, never mended beyond crude stitching. As they rotted, they symbolized the passage of time and the persistence of faith. But they also bred flies and maggots, leaving stains on marble floors. This contradiction was accepted without hesitation. Children grew up watching their mothers practice it. Little girls were told that their own shoes would one day carry blessings. They learned early that discomfort was normal, that pain was sacred, and that foul odour was not shameful if it served a divine purpose. Such lessons ensured the cycle continued. Travelling outside the palace made the habit worse. Shoes collected mud, dung, and stagnant water. Each step through the streets pressed filth deeper into the leather. When they returned to the palace, no one cleaned them. Instead, the contamination travelled indoors, turning the floor of the temple into a path of bacteria. Still, worshippers bowed their heads as though nothing was amiss. The belief that the gods walked with them was stronger than reason. No healer, no philosopher, no protest was enough to change the devotion. The shoe was not footwear, but a vessel of spirit. Replacing it was a betrayal, and betrayal was worse than illness. This conviction explains why so many women limped, why so many carried hidden pain, and why so many left behind traces of disease on the floors of Rome. Archaeological evidence sometimes reveals shoes buried with their owners. The leather is stiff, blackened, and fused with bone. The decay of centuries has preserved the proof that they were never removed, never exchanged for healthier ones. Such relics serve as silent testimony to the cost of faith. The story of never-changing shoes reflects more than hygiene. It speaks of how belief can shape the body, how ritual can demand endurance even at the cost of health. It also shows the contradictions of Roman nobility, where divine favour was pursued through practices that degraded human dignity. In the end, the sacred footprint was less about protection and more about submission. Women believed they carried divine steps, but in truth, they carried decay with every stride. The empire itself celebrated power while its nobles dragged rotting leather across marble floors. They wore their shoes until they fell apart, embracing the pain as a holy bond. The smell, the sores, and the swelling were endured as proof of loyalty. It was a habit born of faith but carried into corruption. And within the grandeur of Rome, the echo of those feet told a story not of glory but of slow ruin. Their devotion to leather relics carried them through halls where incense mixed with the odour of rot. It was one more contradiction of a world that valued appearances while ignoring decay. Another ritual, equally strange and painful, awaited them. In the palaces of Rome, beauty rituals often reached levels that blur the line between devotion and decay. One custom involved collecting the bathwater of another person, usually a noble or someone regarded as favoured by the gods. This water, cloudy with oils, sweat, and flakes of skin, was believed to hold divine essence. When applied to the face with a cloth or sponge, it was said to transfer charm and vitality. The illusion was that beauty could be borrowed, carried from one body to another, without the effort of one's own. Servants were ordered to gather this water after a bath ended. They dipped jars or cloths into the tub, squeezing out the liquid into vessels. Often, the water had already cooled and begun to sour, yet that did not matter. Nobles believed it retained the aura of its former bather, whether that person was a queen, a priestess, or a woman thought to resemble Venus. It was placed on faces like an anointing, held against the cheeks until the skin absorbed it. It is almost comic to imagine someone proudly patting onto their face what we would now pour straight down a drain. The smell was strong. Oils mixed with sweat gave a sour tang, and perfumes once pleasant turned rancid. As the water aged, bacteria thrived. Cloths soaked in this liquid carried more danger than blessing. When pressed onto pores, they caused rashes, boils, and infections. Yet these marks were dismissed as signs of cleansing. Pain was folded into the belief, convincing women that discomfort meant the ritual was working. Among the nobility, the habit was a sign of status. Only those with access to the bathwater of queens or high priestesses could boast of such a practice. Slaves carried the jars through corridors, careful not to spill a drop, as if the liquid was sacred. In truth, it was filled with residue that no one today would tolerate on their skin. If compared with today, it would be like saving the dirty water from someone's shower and selling it in bottles as luxury skincare. The illusion of beauty passing through contact was powerful. In a society where gods were thought to influence every detail of life, the idea that divinity lingered in water seemed natural. If Venus blessed a woman's bath, then surely the droplets that clung to her skin carried part of her charm. Those droplets, diluted and mixed with grime, became the foundation of this ritual. The practice also reveals how little was understood about hygiene. Germs were unknown, bacteria invisible. What could not be seen was not considered dangerous. Instead, people trusted what could be smelled or touched, and in this case, they chose to believe in power hidden within decay. I find it unsettling to picture noble women pressing rancid cloths to their faces, surrounded by marble and gold, convinced they were absorbing divine beauty. The routine is repeated daily. Old water was never thrown away if it was considered sacred. Cloths that reeked were reused again and again, breeding layers of infection. Sometimes jars of stale bath water were kept in corners, covered loosely, as though saving it preserved its essence. Slaves sometimes dipped their hands into these jars, their skin breaking out with sores, yet no one dared question the order. Over time, the skin of women who followed this practice often bore permanent damage. Scars spread across the cheeks. Dark spots stained their foreheads. Yet within the court, these flaws were hidden under layers of powder and pigment. Rather than questioning the cause, people layered ritual upon ritual, covering one harm with another. This contradiction lay at the heart of Roman beauty. Grandeur stood beside filth, elegance beside rot. Marble baths gleamed while the water within carried unseen disease. Perfumed halls echoed with laughter while rashes spread beneath painted cheeks. For those who lived in such circles, appearances mattered more than truth. Reports passed through whispers. Some said queens smelled sweet like the goddess Venus, though attendants who carried jars knew the truth. The scent was not divine, but rancid. Myths covered the reality, transforming the odour of decay into the fragrance of holiness. The story repeated itself until belief triumphed over sense. Archaeological traces are rare, but some jars have been uncovered with residue that suggests cosmetic use. Thick sediment of oils, ash, and plant matter points to mixtures once considered sacred. It is difficult not to imagine them filled with bath water turned sour, stored away as if holding treasure. These relics remind us that beauty rituals often preserve superstition more than health. This ritual also highlights the imbalance of power. The beauty of one woman was taken to enhance another, while slaves bore the burden of handling foul liquid. Their hands, red and blistered, carried jars without protest. Their silence was the foundation of the custom, and their suffering was invisible in the glittering halls of Rome. The act of applying another's bath water was less about skincare and more about devotion. It symbolized submission to ideals of beauty and divinity, even when those ideals demanded enduring infection and odor. It was a practice of faith, reinforced by fear of losing favor. To us, the idea seems absurd, even grotesque. Yet in Rome, it was part of normal life, a habit repeated without question. passed from mothers to daughters, justified by priests and celebrated in gossip. What endured was not the glow of youth, but the scars of neglect. Women pressed the cloths onto their cheeks, inhaling the sour scent, convincing themselves of beauty. Servants bowed, holding jars, never daring to speak. In that silence, the empire tolerated one more contradiction: the worship of decay in the name of charm. They treated rancid water as a gift, and their skin bore the consequences. The ritual thrived because belief was stronger than sense, and the promise of divine beauty outweighed the stench of rot. Yet behind the perfumes and powders, the truth remained. Their faith in used bath water was proof that beauty in Rome was built on illusions. It was one of many customs where luxury disguised decay and devotion disguised disease. Another practice was carried out that carried even sharper consequences, leaving scars not only on the skin but within the body itself. Among the strangest rituals of Roman queens was the use of oil gathered from burning lamps, especially those kept in temples or sacred chambers. The oil was not fresh, it was thick, blackened by soot, and carried the acrid smell of smoke. Servants scraped it from bowls after flames had consumed the wicks, storing the residue in clay jars. This burnt oil, still warm, was carried back to the women of the court and carefully applied to their skin. It was not meant to clean or to perfume, but to act as a shield against the passing of the years. They believed that the sacrifice of comfort, even pain, would purchase beauty that endured. When rubbed on the face, the oil caused sharp stinging. Its heat lingered, leaving the skin red and swollen. Blisters sometimes formed, which later peeled to reveal raw layers beneath. To Roman noblewomen, this was not considered damage but renewal. The outer skin was thought to be burned away, leaving the flesh underneath younger, brighter, closer to perfection. It is difficult not to laugh at the idea of elite women willingly smearing lamp soot on their faces and calling it rejuvenation. The setting made the ritual even more dramatic. Rooms glowed with dim light, the smell of burning wicks still thick in the air. Slaves dipped cloths into the residue, then pressed them onto cheeks and foreheads. The crackle of cooling oil was sometimes heard as it touched the skin. For those who endured it, the burning sensation was described as proof of the ritual's power. The worse the pain, the greater the sacrifice, and therefore the greater the beauty. The belief was tied to ideas of offering and devotion. Oil burned in temple lamps was seen as sacred, touched by the gods. By spreading it onto the body, one was thought to absorb divine strength. In this way, the queens turned ordinary pain into a symbol of holiness. To outsiders, the sight might have seemed brutal, but within the palace, it was a performance of piety and vanity combined. The smell clung to skin for hours. Burnt oil carried with it the memory of fire, and even perfumes struggled to hide it. Women walked through the corridor, leaving faint trails of smoke, as though they were altars themselves. In a society where appearances were everything, even this odour was twisted into meaning. It was whispered that only those who endured such suffering could carry the aura of divinity. The damage, however, was real. Faces darkened with scars, patches of peeling skin, and long-term irritation. Infection often followed, especially when sores opened. Yet rather than abandoning the practice, many doubled down, insisting that repeated application would eventually perfect the result. The cycle of harm became endless, because to admit failure would mean losing face in a culture obsessed with prestige. If compared with modern times, it would be like smearing used engine oil on one's skin as an anti-aging cream, while convincing yourself that the stinging was proof of its luxury. Doctors of the period had little knowledge of skin health. What mattered more were omens and tradition. Healers sometimes encouraged the practice, saying that the heat purified impurities, much like fire cleanses metal. The idea of burning away weakness appealed to Roman minds shaped by ritual and sacrifice. They believed youth could be renewed by fire, and women bore the cost on their faces. I cannot help but think of how cruel this must have felt. The sting, the blisters, the shame of scars hidden under layers of powder. To imagine a queen seated in marble halls, attendants at her side, while her skin burned from soot and oil, is to see how far belief can carry people away from comfort and reason. It is unsettling to realize how much suffering was tolerated in the name of beauty, when health itself was slowly destroyed. Archaeological evidence hints at these practices. Some containers have been found with residues of burnt oil and ash, mixed with crushed herbs or wax. Their presence in private quarters suggests cosmetic rather than religious use. Though difficult to prove, the stories in Roman writings align with these traces, painting a picture of rituals that blurred the lines between worship and vanity. The symbolism of fire and oil carried deep cultural meaning. Fire was life, transformation, and destruction all at once. Oil fed the flame, and in turn, the flame was thought to release hidden power. By putting this oil on the skin, women believed they shared in that cycle. They were offering themselves as living vessels of the god's strength, though what they truly gained was pain and scars. Despite the harm, the practice spread. Gossip and imitation carried it from palace to palace. The most powerful women set the standard, and others followed, fearing exclusion if they did not. Beauty was not only personal, but political. To refuse was to appear weak, and weakness had no place in the harsh eyes of Rome. Over time, many faces bore the marks. Beneath layers of white powders and rouge, there were burns and blemishes. Yet society turned away, choosing to admire the illusion rather than acknowledge the cost. Just as with other dangerous practices, the empire tolerated decay as long as appearances were maintained. The queens believed they were preserving youth. In reality, they were destroying it with each application. Their devotion to beauty became a form of slow sacrifice, given daily in private rooms, while public life demanded a constant display of perfection. They sat before bronze mirrors, oil burning in lamps beside them, and spread soot across their faces. Their reflections showed redness and peeling, but their minds saw renewal. In the silence of those chambers, the empire allowed suffering to masquerade as devotion. They turned burnt oil into a tool of vanity, convincing themselves that scars were signs of youth restored. It was one more contradiction in a society that prized strength but accepted decay. This ritual, brutal and absurd, carved its mark on both faces and memory. The devotion to beauty through fire reveals the extremes of Roman life. Pain was normalized, scars were hidden, and belief outweighed sense. What remained was not youth, but evidence of sacrifice, a silent testimony to the cost of vanity. The practice left women scarred, yet its legend endured. It was one of many rituals where the pursuit of beauty crossed into harm, leaving behind a story as dark as the soot itself. Another habit of the queens took this devotion further, demanding not just contact with fire but contact with death itself. Among the darkest of the beauty rituals practiced by queens in ancient Rome was the custom of lying beside the carcasses of rare animals. It was believed that the essence of these creatures, whether a leopard, a peacock, or a pale donkey, would seep into the skin during the night. By sleeping near such remains, women hoped to absorb strength, grace, and fragrance. This was not an act of secrecy, but one of prestige, whispered about as proof of divine favour. The animals were chosen carefully. Their rarity was part of their power. A queen who could command the death of such creatures displayed her control not only over nature, but also over wealth and dominion. The body of the animal was placed close to the bed, sometimes beneath a thin veil of cloth, other times laid bare. The room filled with the odour of decay within hours. Attendants were ordered to endure the stench in silence, for to complain would be to question the queen's pursuit of beauty. Nights spent in such company were long and suffocating. The air grew heavy as flesh softened and rot spread. Yet belief turned that stench into perfume. Women convinced themselves that what they inhaled was power. They imagined that each breath carried particles of majesty, and each hour spent lying still was a step toward radiance. The absurdity of calling the smell of rotting animal flesh royal fragrance would be laughable if it were not so tragic. The presence of these corpses often made chambers unbearable for others. Servants who entered in the morning gagged and held cloths to their faces. Still, they were expected to treat the scene as sacred. Incense was sometimes burned, not to hide the odour, but to frame it as holy. The mingling of smoke and decay created a haze that clung to skin, hair, and clothing long after the ritual ended. This practice reveals more than superstition. It reflects a culture where appearance outweighed health, and where suffering was justified if it served vanity. If compared to today, it would be like someone placing a dead animal beside their bed and claiming its smell made them glamorous, while others politely pretended to believe it. The damage was not only physical but also psychological. Sleep was restless, skin broke into rashes, and breathing in the fumes caused dizziness and fever. Yet none of these consequences stopped the ritual. On the contrary, the hardships were interpreted as signs that the essence of the animal was working. The more unbearable the experience, the greater the sacrifice, and therefore the greater the supposed beauty gained. I cannot help but feel a deep unease imagining queens, wrapped in silk, surrounded by marble, choosing to spend their nights inhaling the stench of death. It is chilling to realize that even in halls filled with gold and music, decay was deliberately invited to lie beside them in the name of beauty. Whispers spread through the empire. Some praised these women as touched by gods. Others mocked them behind closed doors, yet the practice remained, reinforced by fear of exclusion. To refuse was to risk appearing less divine, less powerful, and so the cycle endured, fueled by vanity and silence. Over time, the results became impossible to ignore. Queens who practiced these rituals often aged prematurely. Their bodies weakened, their health declined, and yet their reputations glowed with tales of beauty preserved by exotic means. The contradiction between myth and reality became another unspoken truth of Roman life. The use of carcasses as perfume marked a final extreme in a long chain of grotesque practices. It was not simply about scent, but about domination, a proof that life and death could be bent to serve the desires of the powerful. The palace chambers, filled with both silk and stench, became symbols of how far obsession could reach. The memory of these acts survived in rumours, in fragments of text, and in the unearthed remains of chambers where traces of decay lingered in soil and stone. They stand as a reminder that vanity, unchecked, can invite horror into the most exalted spaces. This final ritual closes the long story of Roman queens and their appalling hygiene. Each practice, from urine rinses to burnt oil, reveals not elegance but desperation. The empire that prided itself on grandeur accepted rot, blood, and poison in the private lives of its rulers. They traded comfort for pain, health for scars, and dignity for illusion. In pursuit of eternal youth, they embraced decay, believing that beauty demanded sacrifice at any cost. What remains for us is not their glow, but the evidence of suffering etched in history. They sought fragrance in corpses, freshness in urine, and renewal in soot. Yet what they found was disease, disfigurement, and the quiet ruin of their own bodies. The obsession with appearance became their undoing, leaving behind lessons as bitter as they are unforgettable. This concludes the tale of the disgusting hygiene habits of Roman queens. Their devotion to beauty, carried to extremes, reveals how far belief and vanity can warp daily life. It shows that even at the height of power, fear of aging and loss of charm drove choices that invited pain and death. Thank you for staying through this journey into the darker corners of history. May these stories remind us that the pursuit of beauty has often been tangled with danger, and that what seems glamorous can hide decay. Good night, and may your rest be free of the shadows that haunted the palaces of Rome.